Hey guys, tonight we're going to step into a time machine and witness the birth of a terrifying new power. Not a weapon, but an idea that reshaped the human mind forever. Imagine, we are standing on the banks of the Euphrates River, 5,500 years ago. The heat here is physical, a heavy blanket pressing down on your shoulders. The air smells of wet mud, drying reeds, and the copper tang of a slow-moving river. Around us, as far as the eye can see, is a flat, brown, alluvial plain that looks like it stretches into eternity. But in this flat, desolate landscape, a structure rises that shouldn't exist. It's a mountain made by human hands, a ziggurat of whitewashed brick gleaming so brightly under the Mesopotamian sun that it hurts your eyes to look at it. This isn't just a big house, it is a machine for communicating with the gods, and it marks the exact moment humanity decided to stop just surviving and start building. Over an incredibly short period, the people here went from small bands of villagers to citizens of a metropolis with 500,000 people, complex laws, high-frequency trading, and a knowledge of the stars that rivals modern astronomy. They invented the wheel, the school, the judge, and the written word, seemingly out of thin air. So where did this explosion of knowledge come from? Did we really figure this all out on our own in a sudden burst of genius? Or were these first humans actually the survivors of something else? Heirs to a lost legacy that was washed away? Thanks to hundreds of thousands of clay tablets recovered from the sand, tonight we will piece together their own records to find the answer. Frankly, if you were dropped here without a translation guide and a jar of sunscreen, you wouldn't survive a single afternoon to realize the magnitude of what you were looking at. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. That small click sends a big signal to the algorithm. That long-form, serious educational content still matters. And to me, it's an incredibly meaningful show of support. Thank you so much for helping keep this channel going strong. It always fascinates me to see where you're all tuning in from. Let me know in the comments where you are in the world and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are standing at the edge of the world, or at least the edge of the world as it was understood at the dawn of recorded history. The ground beneath your sandals is soft, treacherous silt. If you take a step, your foot sinks slightly, leaving an impression that will be baked hard by the sun within an hour. This is the land between the rivers, Mesopotamia. To your left is the Euphrates. Miles to the east runs the Tigris. And unlike the Nile in Egypt, which floods with a polite, rhythmic predictability that allows for easy farming, these rivers are chaotic beasts. They rise without warning, violent and swollen with snowmelt from the distant Zagros mountains, smashing levees and changing course overnight. Living here means living in a state of constant, low-level anxiety. You look at the horizon, squinting against the glare. There are no trees, at least no forests to speak of. No stone quarries, no metal veins bursting from the earth. Just mud, water, and reeds. Millions of reeds rustling in the hot wind, creating a sound like a constant dry whisper. It's a landscape that seems, on paper, to be the worst possible place to start a civilization. It has zero natural resources other than dirt and water. And yet, as you trudge forward, wiping the sweat from your forehead, you see the anomaly. Rising out of this brown flatness are walls. Massive, fortified walls stretching for miles, and behind them, the stepped towers of temples that scrape the sky. You are looking at Uruk, or perhaps Eridu. It doesn't look like a primitive settlement or an overgrown village. It looks like a sci-fi city dropped onto a prehistoric planet. This is the core mystery that keeps archaeologists and historians awake at night. In the standard model of human evolution, progress is supposed to be a slow, painful crawl. We spend 50,000 years banging rocks together, then 20,000 years figuring out how to plant wheat, then another few thousand years learning to pile stones into walls. It's supposed to be a gradient. But here, in the dust of southern Iraq, the curve doesn't slope gently upward. It goes vertical. Historians still argue whether this Uruk Expansion was a rapid indigenous explosion or the result of a migration. But the archaeological strata tell a jarring story. You dig down through the layers of dirt, finding simple pottery and flint tools. And then, boom. Suddenly, you hit a layer containing monumental architecture, mass-produced bevel-rimmed bowls, cylinder seals with intricate carving, and most baffling of all, writing. It's as if the software of humanity received a massive update overnight. As you walk toward the city gates, you have to dodge a caravan of donkeys laden with lapis lazuli. The blue stone isn't from here, it's from Afghanistan, thousands of miles away. That tells you something immediately. This isn't an isolated tribe. This is the hub of a global network. You pass men in woolen skirts and women with elaborate hairstyles pinned with silver. They aren't hunter-gatherers. They don't look like they spend their days chasing gazelles. They look bored. They look busy. They look like us. There is a strange cognitive dissonance walking through these streets. On one hand, the air smells of open sewage and roasting goat meat. Very ancient, very raw. On the other hand, you pass a scribe sitting in the shade of a clay wall, pressing a reed stylus into a wet tablet with the bored efficiency of a data entry clerk. He isn't drawing pictures of deer. He is recording compound interest on a loan for barley. He's doing accounting. This is the shock of Sumer. It forces you to confront the idea that civilization isn't just about technology. It's about a state of mind. It's the decision to organize, to categorize, and to control nature rather than just live in it. But looking at the sheer scale of the walls and the complexity of the canals that divert the river's rage into docile irrigation ditches, you can't help but feel a little suspicious. The leap is too big. It's too fast. Scientific analysis of the region's ancient climate suggests that around this time, a major drying event forced people closer to the rivers, creating a pressure cooker of population density. That's the polite, mainstream explanation. But when you read the tablets these people left behind, the actual words of the men and women who built these walls, they don't talk about social evolution or climate pressure. They don't claim credit for their own genius. If you were to stop that scribe and ask him, "Who invented this writing system? Who taught you to build this ziggurat?" he would look at you like you were an idiot. He wouldn't say, "My ancestors figured it out through trial and error." He would point to the sky. He would say that everything you see, the laws, the bricks, the plow, the very concept of kingship, was given to them, handed down, fully formed like a kit. They call these gifts the me, pronounced May. And they claim that before this city stood here, there was another time, a golden age before a great catastrophe wiped the slate clean. You pause at the foot of the great ziggurat, craning your neck to see the temple at the top, painted in blue to match the heavens. It feels less like a church and more like a landing pad. The wind picks up, blowing grit into your face, whispering through the reed marshes. We are here to find out what they knew. We are here to read the receipts they left behind in the mud. Because if they are right, then everything we think we know about the timeline of human history is wrong. Standing in the shadow of that ziggurat, you turn your attention from the buildings to the builders. You watch the crowd flowing through the narrow, winding streets of the temple district. They are a short, stocky people, many of the men bare-chested and wearing those distinctive sheepskin skirts that look like layers of shaggy wool leaves. The priests have shaved their heads and faces completely smooth, likely a practical measure against lice in this hot, crowded environment, while the common men sport thick, square beards. If you tap one of them on the shoulder and ask who they are, they won't say, "We are Sumerians." That's a word invented by later Akkadian conquerors, and then reused by Victorian archaeologists. No, they call themselves the Sag-Giga. It literally translates to the blackheaded people. It seems like a mundane description. After all, almost everyone in the ancient Near East had black hair, but the distinction matters to them. It implies a specific identity, a separation from the wild tribes roaming the hills. But the real barrier between them and the rest of the world isn't their hair. It's their voices. Listen closely to the chatter in the marketplace. You hear merchants haggling over the price of copper, women gossiping by the well, priests chanting in the distance. The sounds are sharp, clipped, and heavy with breath. It sounds absolutely nothing like the languages that will eventually dominate this region: Hebrew, Arabic, or Aramaic. This is the great Sumerian problem that has baffled scholars for over a century. The language you are hearing is a language isolate. It has no known relatives. It is an orphan. To give you a modern comparison, if you travel through Europe, you can clearly hear the family resemblance between Spanish, Italian, and French. Even English and German share obvious DNA. But Sumerian is like finding a Hungarian speaker in a room full of Japanese tourists. It just doesn't fit the local family tree. Structurally, it's what linguists call agglutinative, meaning they stick words together like Lego bricks to create complex meanings, rather than changing the word endings like we do. So, where did these orphan speakers come from? If you look at a map, there are no arrows pointing to a clear origin. One theory suggests they came down from the Zagros Mountains to the east, bringing their strange language with them. Historians still argue whether specific words for mountains in their language prove this, or if those are just loan words they picked up later. Another theory, one the Sumerians themselves seemed to prefer, hints that they arrived from the sea. From the south, up the Persian Gulf. Perhaps from a mystical land they called Dilmun, modern-day Bahrain. They speak of civilization rising from the waters, not descending from the hills. But there is a third option, one that is perhaps the most fascinating because you can still see it today. Imagine wandering away from the city walls, down toward the marshlands where the Tigris and Euphrates bleed into a vast, watery delta. Here, the land isn't really land at all. It's a floating world of crushed reeds and mud. You see families living on artificial islands made of compressed vegetation. They build massive, arched, cathedral-like halls entirely out of reeds, bending the tall stalks into intricate bundles that form tension structures strong enough to stand for decades. These are the ancestors of the Mardan, the marsh Arabs of southern Iraq. Until the 1990s, when Saddam Hussein tragically drained the marshes to punish them, the Mardan lived in reed houses that were virtually identical to the carvings found on 5,000-year-old Sumerian cylinder seals. It is an unbroken architectural lineage stretching back to the Stone Age. It is entirely possible that the Sag-Giga didn't arrive from anywhere. They might have been the marsh dwellers who simply decided, or were forced, to solidify their floating world into sun-baked bricks. They took the technology of weaving reeds and applied it to weaving society. However, looking back at the city, you can sense the tension. The Sag-Giga know they are different. They are surrounded by Semitic-speaking nomads, the Martu, whom they view with a mixture of fear and disgust. There are ancient texts where Sumerian city-dwellers roast these nomads, describing them as people who do not know grain, people who dig up truffles in the foothills, and, most insultingly, people who do not bury their dead. To the Sumerians, the wall of the city represents the boundary of the universe that makes sense. Inside is order, math, beer, and the gods. Outside is the steppes, a chaotic void filled with people who don't know how to behave. This siege mentality is baked into their psychology. They feel like a precarious island of high culture in a sea of barbarism. And perhaps that is why they are so obsessed with recording everything. When you are an anomaly, when you feel like a stranger in your own land, you document your existence to prove you are real. You write it down on the one thing that will outlast the reeds, the mud, and the flesh. You write it on clay. But before they built the great brick metropolises like Uruk, there was one place that started it all. A place that wasn't just a city, but a holy anchor point for the entire civilization. To understand where the blackheaded people believe they came from, we have to leave the busy streets of Uruk and travel south, to the edge of the fresh water abyss, to the mound of creation itself. You leave the bustling, chaotic noise of Uruk behind and travel south. The landscape changes. The irrigation canals become wider, the marshland creeps closer, and the air grows heavy with humidity. You are approaching Eridu. To a modern archaeologist, Eridu is a lonely mound of wind-eroded sandstone in the middle of nowhere. But to the person standing next to you in 3500 BCE, this is the center of the universe. This is where the needle dropped on the record of history. Kingship first descended from heaven to Eridu. That is the opening line of the Sumerian king list. It is a statement of absolute primacy. Before Eridu, there were no kings, no cities, no civilization, only scattered tribes wandering in the dark. As you approach, the first thing you notice is the silence. Unlike the commercial hubbub of Uruk, Eridu feels monastic. It is a holy city, a Vatican of the marshes. And rising from its center is the Abzu, the house of the Abzu. This temple isn't just a place of worship, it is an architectural onion. Archaeologists eventually dug here and found not one, not two, but 18 temples stacked on top of each other. Like a Russian nesting doll of devotion, the Sumerians built and rebuilt on this exact spot for thousands of years. They refused to move even a few feet to the left or right. Why? Because this spot wasn't chosen for its view or its strategic value. It was chosen because of what lies beneath it. The Abzu, or Apsu, is a concept that is hard for our modern minds to grasp. Physically, it refers to the massive aquifer of fresh, sweet water that flows deep underground, the source of the springs that made life possible in this desert. But metaphysically, the Abzu is the abyss, the deep, dark, formless void of knowledge and secrets. It is the domain of Enki, the god of wisdom, magic, and fresh water. Imagine standing in the central sanctuary of the Abzu. The floor is covered in fish bones, thousands of years of offerings to the water god. The air is cool, insulated by the thick mud brick walls. You can hear the faint trickle of water from a sacred pool. It feels ancient, even to the people living here in 3500 BCE. The Sumerian creation myth, much like the scientific theory of evolution, begins in the water. They believed that in the beginning, there was only Namu, the primeval sea. There was no sky, no earth, just an endless, swirling ocean of potential. Then, out of this watery chaos, a cosmic mountain emerged, the separation of An, heaven, and Ki, earth. Eridu is that mountain. It is the first piece of dry land to rise from the waters, the mound of creation. If this sounds familiar, it should. This imagery of land emerging from water is found in Genesis, in Egyptian mythology, and in almost every culture that relies on rivers. But here in Eridu, it feels less like a myth and more like a memory of the geography itself. This region was once under the Persian Gulf. The sea retreated, leaving behind the mud flats. The land literally rose from the water. But Eridu isn't just about geology. It's about the firsts. This is where the Mi, those divine blueprints of civilization we touched on earlier, were stored. It was thought that Enki kept them here, guarding the source code of humanity in his underwater palace. As you walk the perimeter of the temple complex, you realize something unsettling. Eridu was never a massive residential city like Uruk. It didn't have the sprawling slums. It was a pilgrimage site. People came here to touch the source. They came to consult the oracle of the water god. This obsession with the deep suggests a culture that revered the underground, the hidden, and the ancient. They didn't look up to the stars for their origin. They looked down. They believed wisdom bubbled up from below. And it was here, in this sacred silence, that they say the gods first landed. Not as vague spirits, but as architects. The texts describe Enki walking the marshes, decreeing the fate of the land. When Enki rose, the fishes rose. When Enki came near, the rain fell. This brings us to the most controversial and electrifying part of the Sumerian story. Who exactly were these beings that walked among them? Were they just personifications of natural forces? Statues made of metaphors? Or does the terrifying specificity of the Sumerian descriptions point to something else? Because when you read the texts carefully, the gods don't act like clouds or rivers. They act like administrators. They have schedules. They have tempers. And they have a very specific agenda for the creatures they are about to create. Now, we have to talk about the landlords. If you walk from the silence of Eridu into the bustling streets of any major Sumerian city, you will notice that life revolves entirely around one massive central house, the temple. But you need to purge your mind of the modern idea of religion. When we think of gods today, we usually think of ethereal spirits, invisible forces of morality, or vague clouds of love that exist everywhere and nowhere. The Sumerians would have found that idea ridiculous. To them, the gods were not abstract concepts. They were neighbors. They were physical, heavy, demanding beings who lived in the big house on top of the ziggurat. They ate, they drank, they slept, they had sex, and they fought with their siblings. These are the Anunnaki. You've probably heard that word thrown around on late-night cable TV shows featuring guys with wild hair talking about aliens. But let's strip away the modern conspiracy theories and look at what the Sumerian text actually says, because the reality is strange enough on its own. The term Anunnaki roughly translates to those of royal blood, or the princely seed. A more poetic interpretation, and the one that fuels the sci-fi theories, breaks it down as An, heaven, and Ki, earth, meaning those who came from heaven to earth. In the texts, They are described not as spirits, but as a high-tech aristocracy. They are the decision-makers, but they aren't the only class of gods. There is a lower tier, the working-class deities called the Igigi. If the Anunnaki are the board of directors, the Igigi are the middle managers and the laborers. So what did these beings look like? If you were a Sumerian standing at the foot of the ziggurat, you wouldn't dare look up to find out. The texts describe the gods as being surrounded by a terrifying physical phenomenon called melam. Melam is often translated as splendor or radiance, but those words are too pretty. Melam was a weaponized aura. It was a terrifying, awe-inspiring luminosity that covered the god like a garment. If a human looked directly at it, they would be overwhelmed with fear, essentially paralyzed by the sheer voltage of the god's presence. It is depicted almost like a physical substance. A god could take off their melam and hang it on a hook, or pile it up in a corner. Historians still argue whether this description of melam was a metaphor for the psychological power of kingship, or if the Sumerians were literally describing some kind of technology or bioluminescence that we don't understand. But the most defining characteristic of the Anunnaki wasn't their glow, it was their hunger. In the Sumerian worldview, humans were not created to be loved. We were not children of God, we were staff. The entire city-state model was set up as a massive estate management system. The city of Nippur belonged to Enlil. The city of Eridu belonged to Enki. The city of Uruk belonged to Inana. The humans living there were essentially tenant farmers working the gods' private land. This wasn't symbolic. Every single day, the priests would bring massive platters of food, bread, beer, roasted mutton, fruit, into the inner sanctuary of the temple and set it before the statue of the god. They believed the god consumed the essence, or the aroma of the food, and God help you if the dinner was late. There are letters, actual complaint letters written on clay, where priests panic because the delivery of onions was delayed, and they were terrified the god would get hangry and smite the city with a plague. It creates a picture of a relationship based not on faith, but on fear and service. This view of the divine completely changes the vibe of the civilization. The Sumerians were a deeply anxious people because they lived under the thumb of super beings who were prone to mood swings. Enlil, the chief executive of the Anunnaki, is often portrayed as distant and easily annoyed by human noise. Enki, on the other hand, is the clever, mischievous scientist who sometimes breaks the rules to help us. It's a corporate drama played out on a cosmic scale. The Anunnaki hold the me, the blueprints of power, and the Igigi do the grunt work. But here is where the story takes a sharp turn toward the rebellious. According to the ancient myths, this system wasn't sustainable. Before humans existed, the gods had to do all the work themselves. The Anunnaki made the Igigi dig the canals. They made them dredge the Tigris and Euphrates rivers to keep the water flowing. Imagine these lesser gods, thousands of years ago, toiling in the mud, hauling baskets of dirt, complaining about their back pain. For 2,500 years, the text says, they bore the excess load, day and night. And then they snapped. The oldest labor strike in recorded history wasn't organized by coal miners or factory workers. It was organized by gods. The Igigi decided they had enough. They threw their tools into the fire. They set their baskets aflame. And in the middle of the night, they marched on the house of Enlil, the boss, surrounding his ziggurat and chanting for war. This moment, the strike of the gods, is the inciting incident for the existence of humanity. We weren't a deliberate creation born of love. We were a scab labor force created to break a strike. So picture the scene. It is the middle of the night. The great god Enlil, the CEO of Earth, is sleeping in his sanctuary at Nippur. Outside, the mob of angry Igigi gods has surrounded the building. They are chanting, banging their tools together, and they have literally set their shovels on fire. This is a violent insurrection. Enlil wakes up in a panic. He sees the glow of the torches and realizes his own workforce is about to tear him limb from limb. He calls an emergency board meeting of the Anunnaki. The mood is tense. Enlil wants to crush the rebellion with force, to wipe out the strikers. But Enki, the wise counselor who always plays the role of the defense attorney, raises his hand. He points out that the rebels have a point. The work is too hard. The canals are endless. The mud is heavy. Even a god's back can break. But the work still needs to be done. The cosmos must be maintained. Enki proposes a radical solution. Let us create a substitute, he says. Let us create a Lulu. The word Lulu is often translated as man, but in the earliest texts, it carries a much more specific functional meaning. The mixed one, or effectively, the primitive worker. The proposal is simple. Engineer a biological robot that is smart enough to take orders and use tools, but docile enough to control. A creature that can bear the yoke of the gods, so the gods can go back to being idle. This brings us to the recipe for humanity, found in the Epic of Atrahasis. If you are expecting a poetic breath of life moment where God gently molds Adam from dust, brace yourself. The Sumerian version is far more industrial and, frankly, gruesome. Enki calls upon the birth goddess Nintu, also known as Mami. He tells her to mix a specific batch of clay from the Abzu, the deep, watery abyss we visited earlier. But clay alone is just mud. It has no spark. To give this creature the ability to understand commands, to plan, and to fear, they need a catalyst. They need divine DNA. The Council of the Gods decides that one of their own must die to fuel this experiment. They choose a god named Geshtue, or sometimes We'ila. The text specifically notes that Geshtue is a god who has teme, a word that means intelligence or planning, but also implies a ghost or spirit. So, in a ritual that sounds like something out of a dark fantasy novel, the gods slaughter Geshtue. They drain his blood and mix it into the clay. Let the god be slaughtered, the text reads. Let the gods be cleansed by immersion. With his flesh and his blood, let Nintu mix the clay. That god and man may be thoroughly mixed in the clay, so that in the man there is a spirit. This is the defining paradox of the human condition, according to the Sumerians. We are a hybrid. We are half mud, destined to die, to rot, to belong to the earth. But we are also half God, filled with the blood of a high-intelligence divinity. This explains why we are so tormented. We have the minds of gods trapped in the bodies of animals. We have the ambition to touch the stars, but we are programmed to dig ditches. The womb goddesses then take this blood clay mixture and pinch off 14 pieces, 7 males and 7 females. They incubate them for 10 months, a month of the moon, until the first humans are birthed. The experiment is a success. The Lulu picks up the shovel. The gods rejoice. They set their tools on fire, this time in celebration, and retire to their high temples to eat, drink, and listen to music while the humans trudge into the fields to start the harvest. This origin story creates a very specific psychological baseline for the Sumerian people. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, humanity falls from grace. We started in paradise and lost it. But in the Sumerian tradition, we started in the mud. We were never fallen because we were never high to begin with. We were built to serve. This is why you don't find much love for the gods in these early texts. You find respect, you find fear, and you find a lot of transactional bargaining. I built you this temple, I gave you this beer. Now please don't let the river flood my house. It's an employee-employer relationship, but there is a glitch in Enki's design. The Lulu was supposed to be a sterile worker, like a mule. But somewhere in the mixing of the blood, or perhaps through Enki's secret intention, the humans began to reproduce on their own. And they began to learn. They didn't just dig. They started to wonder. They started to look at the me, those divine tablets of technology that the gods guarded so jealously. They realized that if they could get their hands on the source code, they wouldn't have to be slaves forever. They could become like the gods. And this leads us to the concept of the me, the most fascinating and difficult idea in Sumerian philosophy. Because civilization, according to them, wasn't something that developed slowly over time. It was a set of preloaded programs that could be stolen, downloaded, and installed. So, you have your city walls, you have your angry gods, and you have your genetically modified workforce of Lulus holding shovels. But you are missing the most important component of a civilization. You are missing the software. In the Sumerian worldview, concepts like justice, kingship, music, or even prostitution were not abstract ideas that humans slowly developed over centuries of trial and error. They were physical objects. They were downloadable assets called the me. Pronounced may, this concept is one of the hardest things for modern minds to wrap around. Yet it is essential to understanding why Sumerian history feels so instant. The me were the divine decrees, the fundamental formulas that made society function. And the gods hoarded them like nuclear launch codes. Imagine you want to start a city. You can't just make up the rules as you go. You need the me of law. You need the me of bricklaying. You need the me of high priesthood. Without these, your society is just a bunch of people standing around in the mud. We actually have a list of these me from a text found at Uruk, and reading it feels like looking at the root directory of the human experience. It contains over 100 items, ranging from the incredibly grand to the bizarrely specific. On the list you find the me of Enlil ship, supreme authority, and the me of truth. But right next to them, you find the me of sexual intercourse, the me of the standardized measuring rod, the me of the spark of fire, and the me of the prostitute. There is even a me for lamentation, literally the divine instruction manual on how to be sad correctly. Historians still argue whether the me were actual physical objects, perhaps carved tablets, ceremonial costumes, or insignias, or if they were just a metaphor for divine power. But the myths treat them as small, portable items that you could carry, stack, and, most importantly, steal. This brings us to one of the greatest heist movies in ancient literature, Inana and Enki. Remember Inana? She is the goddess of Uruk, the queen of heaven, and arguably the most ambitious personality in the Sumerian pantheon. She wants her city, Uruk, to be the greatest metropolis on Earth. But to do that, she needs the source code. And the source code is kept by Enki, the old wizard of fresh water, down in Eridu. So, Inanna devises a plan. She travels down the river to the Abzu. She doesn't bring an army. She brings her charm. She sits down to drink beer with Enki. Now, Sumerian beer was thick, heavy stuff, and Enki apparently loved it. As the night goes on and the beer jars are emptied, Enki gets loose-lipped. In a moment of drunken generosity, he looks at Inanna and says, "By the name of my power, I will give you the me." He starts handing them over. "I give you the high priesthood. I give you the crown. I give you truth. I give you descent into the underworld. I give you the art of the woodworker." Inanna doesn't hesitate. She loads these divine decrees onto her boat of heaven one by one. She takes the me of heroism, the me of treachery, the me of wisdom, and even the me of the kissing of the phallus. It's a total system dump. She takes the entire operating system of civilization. While Enki is passing out, Inanna jumps in her boat and pushes off, racing back upstream toward Uruk. When Enki wakes up the next morning with a massive hangover, he looks around his empty palace. He asks his servant, Isimud, "Where are the me?" Isimud essentially replies, "You gave them all to your daughter last night, sir." Enki panics. He realizes he has just given away the keys to the universe. He sends an army of sea monsters, giant carp and winged demons, to chase Inanna's boat and seize the me. But Inanna fights them off and manages to dock at Uruk. As she unloads the me, the text describes the city of Uruk changing. Suddenly, it has the power of governance. It has the power of art. It has the power of war. Uruk becomes the new center of the world, not because it had better soldiers, but because it had the data. This story is profound because it frames civilization as a kit. It supports the Sumerian assertion that they didn't invent their culture, they inherited it, or in Inanna's case, swindled it, from the older gods. It also implies that civilization is fragile. If you lose the me, you lose the ability to function. There are tragic texts describing cities that have been conquered, where the poet laments, "The me have been overturned." It doesn't just mean the laws were changed. It means the fundamental physics of their society collapsed. The me of truth vanished, so people could no longer speak honestly. The me of grain vanished, so the crops failed. It sounds remarkably like a computer crashing because a critical .dll file is missing. But there is a darker implication here. If the me are the software, and the Lulu, humans, are the hardware, how exactly does the program run? How does a human being in 3000 BCE receive these commands? Today we have an internal monologue. You have a voice in your head that says, "I should probably go to sleep," or "I wonder if I left the stove on." We call this consciousness. We assume humans have always had this. But there is a controversial, mind-bending theory that suggests the Sumerians, the people who invented writing and math, did not think like we do. They didn't have an internal monologue. When they needed to make a decision, they didn't think about it. They heard a voice, and they believed that voice was God. This brings us to the bicameral mind. It's one of those theories that sounds absolutely insane when you first hear it, but the more you read Sumerian texts, the more uncomfortably plausible it becomes. In the 1970s, a psychologist named Julian Jaynes proposed that the humans of this era, the builders of the ziggurats, were not conscious in the way we define it today. Jaynes argued that the ancient mind was split in two. The bicameral, two-chambered brain operated like a master and a slave. The left hemisphere dealt with the mundane tasks of daily life, grinding grain, walking to the temple, feeding the kids. But when a crisis arose, when the river flooded, or a decision had to be made, the left hemisphere didn't analyze the data. It panicked. At that moment of stress, the right hemisphere would kick in. It would process the information and send a command to the left hemisphere. But because the two sides of the brain weren't fully integrated yet, this command wasn't experienced as an internal thought, like, I should run. It was experienced as an auditory hallucination. A loud, clear, authoritative voice speaking from outside the head. To the Sumerian, this wasn't a hallucination. It was the voice of the god. Enlil spoke to me. Inana commanded me. When you read the ancient texts, these phrases are everywhere. We usually interpret them as metaphors, assuming the writer was being poetic. But Janes asks, what if they were being literal? Look at the literature. In the earliest Sumerian stories, characters rarely pause to introspect. You never see Gilgamesh sitting by the river thinking, am I really happy with my life choices? There is no inner space. There is only action and reaction. When something goes wrong, a god appears and tells them exactly what to do. Do not sleep. Build a boat. Abandon your riches. The theory suggests that the entire hierarchical structure of Sumerian society was built to manage these voices. The ziggurat wasn't just a temple, it was a broadcasting tower. The high priest was the person with the clearest reception, the one who could hallucinate the most coherent instructions from the god, the collective right brain authority, and relay them to the masses. The idols, those wide-eyed statues you see in museums, were designed to trigger this state. The enormous eyes were meant to hold your gaze, to induce the hypnotic state necessary to hear the command. The me we discussed earlier, they were the external cues, the physical triggers that kept the voices organized so society didn't dissolve into chaos. But living in a world of hallucinations is exhausting. It works fine for a tribe, but it's terrible for a complex empire. As the cities grew to 50,000 people, you couldn't have everyone hearing their own personal version of Enlil telling them to do different things. You needed a standard. You needed the voice to be frozen in time so everyone could hear the same thing without hallucinating. You needed writing. Janes argues that the invention of writing was the death knell of the bicameral mind. Once you wrote the law down on clay, you didn't need to hear the god's voice to know what to do. You could just check the tablet. The voice on the clay replaced the voice in the head. Over centuries, as literacy and complexity spread, the auditory hallucinations faded. The gods fell silent. The two hemispheres of the brain merged, and the internal monologue was born. We started talking to ourselves instead of listening to them. This transition wasn't painless. In fact, it was traumatic. The later texts are full of anguish. My God has forsaken me. The gods have departed to the heavens. The silence of the gods wasn't a theological shift. It was a neurological rewiring. Humanity was suddenly alone in its own head. If this theory holds even a grain of truth, it reframes the entire Sumerian experience. It suggests that the golden age they mourned, the time when they walked and talked with gods, wasn't a physical reality of aliens landing in spaceships. It was a psychological reality of a brain structure that allowed them to feel a constant, direct connection to the divine authority. And it explains why sleep was so terrifying to them. In a bicameral world, sleep is the state where the voices become uncontrollable. Dreams aren't just random neurons firing. They are the god breaking into the control room while the pilot is away. This is why the Sumerians developed extensive incubation rituals. If you had a problem, you would go to the temple, sacrifice a lamb, and sleep in a special room, hoping that the god would speak to you in the dream state, the last refuge of the bicameral voice. But whether the voices were neurological tricks or actual divine broadcasts, the Sumerians needed a way to capture them. They needed a medium that was permanent, unchangeable, and indestructible. They lived in a world of mud, so they turned to the mud. They found the one material that could survive the fire, the flood, and the silence. They found the clay, and in doing so, they invented the first time machine. So the gods have fallen silent, or at least you need a way to record their orders before you forget them. You need to write. But what do you write on? If you look around the Mesopotamian landscape, your options are depressing. There are no papyrus reeds like in Egypt. The reeds here are too brittle. There are no massive stone cliffs to carve into like the Maya or the Persians would later use. There is no wood for pulp, no animal skins plentiful enough to create parchment for an entire bureaucracy. There is only mud. Endless, sticky, alluvial mud. It's the stuff that gets under your fingernails, ruins your sandals, and bogs down your cart. But the genius of the Sumerians was to look at this annoyance and see a hard drive. Imagine you are a scribe in 3200 BCE. You crouch by the riverbank and scoop up a handful of wet earth. You knead it in your hands, working out the air bubbles, feeling the cool, dense weight of it. It smells like the river, mineral-rich and ancient. You flatten it into a rectangle about the size of a modern smartphone, maybe a little thicker. It fits perfectly in your palm. This is the medium of eternity. It sounds counterintuitive. We tend to think of mud as temporary, something that washes away in the rain. But clay is different. When clay dries, it holds its shape. And if clay is baked, either intentionally in a kiln or accidentally when a library burns down, it undergoes a chemical change. It becomes ceramic. It becomes stone. Think about the fragility of our own history. We write on paper, which rots, mildews, and burns. We write on digital hard drives, which demagnetize, corrode, and become unreadable if the software updates or the power grid fails. If our civilization collapsed tomorrow and a fire swept through our cities, 99% of our knowledge would vanish in smoke. But for the Sumerians, fire wasn't an eraser. It was a preservative. When the great palaces of antiquity were sacked and burned by invading armies, the conquerors thought they were destroying the records of the enemy. In reality, they were firing the kiln. They were baking the tablets into indestructible bricks that would sit in the sand, perfectly legible, for 5,000 years. Now look at the tool in your other hand. It's a reed, cut from the marsh. You've sliced the end of it at a sharp angle to create a triangular tip. You don't write on the clay. You don't smear ink across it. You impress it. You push the reed into the soft surface. Press, lift, press, lift. Each press leaves a distinct wedge-shaped mark. In Latin, the word for wedge is cuneus. This is why we call this script cuneiform. It is literally wedge-shaped writing. The tactile experience of this is incredibly satisfying. There is a rhythm to it, a thump, thump, thump of the stylus hitting the clay. It is three-dimensional writing. It has depth. When you hold a tablet today in a museum, you are putting your fingers in the exact grooves made by a human hand 50 centuries ago. The connection is physical, but there is a limitation. Because you are pressing a stiff reed into clay, you can't easily make curves. You can't draw a flowing circle or a realistic portrait. Everything becomes angular. A head becomes a box. A bowl becomes a triangle. The medium dictates the message. The script becomes abstract, geometric, and highly stylized because the mud demands it. This reliance on clay shaped their entire view of the universe. They believed their bodies were made of clay. They believed the world was a flat disk of clay floating on the ocean. And they believed that immortality was achieved by hardening that clay into something that couldn't be broken. There is a haunting theory that the scribes knew exactly what they were doing. They knew that walls crumble. They knew that gold is stolen and melted down. They knew that oral traditions mutate and die. But a fired clay tablet, that is a time capsule. There are tablets that end with curses. Whosoever breaks this tablet, may Enlil destroy his name. But there are also tablets that seem to whisper to the future. They recorded things that had no economic value, myths, lullabies, proverbs. Why write down a proverb on a permanent ceramic tile unless you want someone not yet born to read it? We often talk about the Stone Age or the Bronze Age, but in reality, this was the Clay Age. They ate from clay bowls, lived in clay houses, wrote on clay tablets, and worshipped gods made of clay. And because of this choice of material, we know more about the daily life of a Sumerian sheepherder than we do about many medieval European kings. We have their receipts. We have their school exercises. We have their complaints about copper quality. But here is the irony. The invention of this writing system didn't happen because they wanted to write poetry. They didn't invent it to record the epic of Gilgamesh or to praise the gods. They invented it because they needed to count. Writing, the greatest intellectual achievement of the human species, was born out of the most boring human activity imaginable: auditing. It's easy to romanticize the birth of writing. We want to believe that the first person to pick up a stylus did so because their heart was bursting with a song, or because they wanted to capture the beauty of the stars. But the truth is much drier. Writing wasn't invented by poets, it was invented by accountants. As the cities of Sumer grew, the old way of doing business, "I'll trade you this goat for that basket of barley," broke down. When you have a temple managing the grain distribution for 50,000 people, you can't rely on memory. You need a ledger. You need to know exactly how many sheep were sent to the temple of Inana, how many jars of oil were owed to the palace, and who hadn't paid their taxes. Before they had tablets, they had tokens. Imagine a small pouch made of leather or cloth. Inside, you find a handful of tiny clay geometric shapes. A small clay cone represents a measure of barley. A clay sphere represents a measure of wheat. A clay disc represents a sheep. For centuries, this was the system. If you sent 5 sheep to the temple, you sent 5 clay discs along with them. The priest would count the sheep, count the discs, and if they matched, the transaction was verified. It was a physical tactile spreadsheet. But there was a flaw. Tokens could be lost. They could be stolen. A dishonest shepherd could slip a few extra tokens into the pouch to claim he delivered more than he did, or remove some to hide a theft. So, the Sumerian accountants came up with a security patch. They invented the bulla, or the clay envelope. Instead of a pouch, they took a ball of wet clay, hollowed it out, put the tokens inside, and then sealed the hole. Now, the record was tamper-proof. You couldn't change the number of tokens without breaking the clay ball. It was a locked file, but this created a new problem. Once the envelope was sealed and dried, you couldn't remember what was inside without breaking it open. If the tax collector came around and asked, "How many sheep are in this account?" you had to smash the file to check the data. That's inefficient. So some brilliant, lazy bureaucrat had a light bulb moment. Before I seal the tokens inside, he thought, why don't I just press them into the outside of the wet clay ball? If there were 5 sheep tokens inside, he would press the sheep token 5 times on the surface. Now he could see the contents without breaking the seal. Then came the second light bulb moment, the one that changed history. If the marks on the outside tell me everything I need to know, why do I need the tokens inside at all? Why do I need the hollow ball? Why don't I just take a flat slab of clay and make the marks on that? In that instant, the three-dimensional token was flattened into a two-dimensional symbol. The object became a sign. The token for sheep, a disc with a cross on it, became the pictograph for sheep. The token for barley became a stalk of grain. The clay envelope collapsed into the clay tablet. Suddenly the system exploded. You weren't limited to physical tokens anymore. You could create a sign for anything. A sign for cow, a sign for beer, a sign for woman. At first, these were just pictures, pictograms. A picture of a foot meant foot. But then the scribes got clever. They started using the rebus principle. Think of it like a game of Pictionary. If you want to write the word belief in English using pictures, you might draw a bee and a leaf. You aren't talking about the insect or the foliage. You are using the sound of the words to build a new meaning. The Sumerians did this. The word for arrow was ti. The word for life was also ti. So they used the sign for an arrow to represent life. Suddenly they could write abstract concepts. They could write immortality. They could write love. They could write anger. The accounting tool had mutated into a voice. The earliest tablets we have, from the Uruk IV period, are 85% economic. 10 sheep to the baker. 3 jars of beer to the foreman. But slowly, over a few centuries, the remaining 15% began to grow. The lists of goods became lists of kings. The lists of kings became stories of battles. And the stories of battles became hymns to the gods. Humanity had crossed the threshold. We were no longer trapped in the now. We could speak to the future. But as this system grew more complex, it required trust. If I send you a tablet promising to pay you 10 shekels of silver next year, how do you know it's really from me? How do you know I won't deny it later? I need a signature. I need a way to lock the document with my personal identity. And so, alongside the tablet, they perfected another invention, a tiny, intricate cylinder that would become the most important personal possession of any ancient Mesopotamian. Imagine you've just finalized a major business deal. You've agreed to sell 50 bushels of barley to a merchant from Ur. The scribe has written it all down on a wet clay tablet. The terms are clear, but now you need to sign it. You need to prove that you, and only you, authorized this transaction. You don't pick up a pen. You reach for your necklace. Hanging around your neck on a leather cord is a small, cylindrical bead, about the size of your thumb. It's made of lapis lazuli, that deep, celestial blue stone imported from the mountains of the east. It looks pretty, like a piece of jewelry, but if you look closely, you see it is covered in incredibly tiny, complex carvings. This is your cylinder seal. It is your ID card, your credit card, and your signature all rolled into one. You take the cylinder and place it on the wet clay at the bottom of the tablet. Then you push down and roll it forward. This is the genius of the design. Unlike a stamp seal, which just leaves a single static image, the cylinder creates a continuous, repeating frieze. As you roll it, a panoramic scene unfolds in the clay. A tiny hero fights a lion. A god sits on a throne drinking beer. A herd of gazelles runs across an infinite plain. It is essentially a prehistoric motion picture. It is an infinite loop of imagery that represents you. The artistry required to make these things is mind-boggling. Remember, the engraver had to carve these images in reverse, negative space, on a curved surface of hard stone, often working on a canvas no bigger than a human fingernail. And they did this without magnifying glasses. They likely used abrasive quartz dust and drills spun by a bowstring. When you roll out a high-quality seal, you can see the muscles on the lion's leg. You can see the fringes on the god's robe. You can see the stars in the sky. It is a masterpiece of microscopic art, hidden in plain sight around your neck. But the cylinder seal wasn't just for signing receipts. It was a security device. Let's say you are storing grain in a warehouse. You put the grain in a jar and tie a piece of leather over the top. Then you take a lump of wet clay and slap it over the knot. You roll your seal across the clay. Now, that jar is locked. If anyone tries to open it, they have to break the clay. And since they don't have your seal, they can't replace it. If you come back and the seal is broken, you know you've been robbed. They used this for everything. They sealed doors. They sealed baskets. They even sealed rooms. A sealed room was essentially a vault. To break the seal was a crime against the owner, and often a crime against the god depicted on the seal. This system created a society of immense personal accountability. Your seal was your reputation. If you lost it, you were in serious trouble. It was like losing your social security number and your house keys at the same time. There were actual public announcements made when a seal was lost, declaring the old one void, just like we cancel a stolen credit card today. It turns the anonymous crowd of the city into a collection of individuals. When we find these seals today, and we have found thousands of them, we are looking at the specific, unique identities of people who lived 5,000 years ago. I am Ur-Nansha, the merchant. I am Enheduanna, the priestess. They rolled their names into history. But trade requires more than just signatures. It requires math. If you are selling 50 bushels of barley, you need to know what 50 is. And you need to know how to divide it, how to tax it, and how to calculate the interest on the loan you took out to grow it. The system they developed to handle these numbers is so robust, so logical, and so deeply embedded in the fabric of reality that you are still using it right now, at this very moment, without even realizing it. Check your watch. Go ahead. Look at the time. If it's 11 p.m., you know that in exactly 60 minutes, it will be midnight. You know that each of those minutes is made of 60 seconds. And if you were to draw a circle around the face of your watch, you know it would be divided into 360 degrees. Why? Why 60? Why not 100 minutes in an hour? Why not 100 degrees in a circle? We count everything else in tens. We have 10 fingers, so we use a base 10, or decimal system, for our money, our kilometers, and our weight. But the moment we talk about time or geometry, we suddenly switch operating systems. We stop counting like modern humans and start counting like ancient Sumerians. This is the sexagesimal system, base 60, and it is one of the most stubborn legacies of the ancient world. It has survived the collapse of empires, the rise of Christianity and Islam, the Industrial Revolution, and the digital age. Every time you glance at a clock, you are paying homage to a mathematician in Uruk who lived 5,000 years ago. But why did they choose 60? It seems arbitrary. It seems hard. Actually, it is the most brilliant number in the universe. Think about base 10. The number 10 is clunky. It can only be cleanly divided by 2 and 5. If you try to divide 10 by 3, you get 3.333, repeating forever. It's messy. If you try to divide it by 4, you get 2.5. Now look at 60. The number 60 is a highly composite number. It is a mathematical superhero. It can be cleanly divided by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. Imagine you are a Sumerian temple administrator. You have a warehouse full of grain and you need to distribute it to your workers. If you have 60 bags of grain, you can divide them evenly among 2 workers, or 3, or 4, or 5, or 6, or 10, or 12. No one fights over the leftovers. No one has to cut a bag in half. It is the ultimate number for trade, logistics, and keeping the peace. There is a theory that this system originated from a very specific way of counting on your hands. Put down your phone and look at your hand. In our modern world, we count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on our fingers. But the Sumerians might have counted the segments of their fingers. Take your thumb and touch the tip of your index finger. Now, use your thumb to count the 3 bone segments, knuckles, of that finger. 1, 2, 3. Move to the middle finger. 4, 5, 6. Ring finger, 7, 8, 9. Pinky, 10, 11, 12. You can count to 12 on one hand using your thumb as a pointer. Now imagine using your other hand to keep track of how many sets of 12 you've counted. You have 5 fingers on that hand. 5 sets of 12 equals 60. It's a tactile calculator built into the human body. This mathematical prowess allowed them to do things that shouldn't have been possible for a Bronze Age society. We have tablets where students calculated the square root of 2 with an accuracy of 5 decimal places. We have tablets calculating compound interest on loans over years. They didn't have computers. They had clay and a base 60 mindset. But numbers weren't just for counting grain. In Sumer, numbers were theology. The gods themselves were ranked by number. It was a cosmic hierarchy codified in digits. Anu, the sky god and father of the pantheon, was number 60. Enlil, the storm god and executive officer, was number 50. Enki, the lord of wisdom and water, was number 40. Sin, the moon god, was 30, for the days of the month. Shamash, the sun, was 20. Inanna, the goddess of Venus, was 15. This numerology of the divine meant that math was a sacred language. To solve an equation was to engage with the structure of the gods, and nowhere was this more apparent than when they turned their eyes upward. Because they had base 60, they could map the sky. They divided the heavens into 360 degrees. They tracked the movements of the planets with an obsessive precision. They didn't just look at the stars, they read them. They realized that the things moving up there were following a schedule that could be calculated, predicted, and recorded on clay. And the people responsible for this task weren't just priests. They were the first scientists. They were the star watchers of the ziggurat. You are standing on the flat roof of the ziggurat at Nippur. It is 2 a.m. The city below you is asleep, a sprawl of silent mud brick shadows. But up here the air is cool and thin. There is no light pollution, no street lamps, no car headlights, no glow from distant cities. The sky above you is a crushing velvet black, so thick with stars that it looks like spilled milk. To you, the sky is a pretty view. To the priest standing next to you, it is a dashboard. These men are the Ensi, the lord of the foundational platform. But in this context, they are the first professional astronomers in history. They spend every night of their lives up here, tracking points of light with an intensity that borders on paranoia. Why? Because in the Sumerian worldview, the sky is the script of the gods writ large. The gods don't just live in the sky, they communicate through it. Every twinkle, every movement, every eclipse is a memo from the management. They noticed two types of stars. Most of them were fixed. They moved together as a single sheet, rotating around the North Star like a vast, jeweled bowl. They called these the writing of the sky. But there were others, 7 specific lights that didn't follow the rules. They wandered. They sped up, slowed down, and sometimes even moved backward. They called these the bibu, the wild sheep. We call them planets. Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, the Sun, and the Moon. To the Sumerian astronomer, these weren't rocks or gas balls. They were the avatars of the gods themselves. Jupiter was Marduk, or Enlil. Venus was Inanna. Mars was Nergal, the god of war and plague. If Mars entered the constellation of the Scorpion, it wasn't just a visual alignment. It meant the god of war was entering the house of poison. It was a tactical alert. They mapped these movements with incredible precision. We have a set of tablets called the MULAPN. This is essentially the Excel spreadsheet of the ancient sky. It lists 66 constellations, the rising and setting times of major stars, and the path of the wild sheep along the ecliptic. It is so accurate that modern astronomers can use it to calculate exactly what the sky looked like over Baghdad in 1000 BCE. But here is where the debate gets heated. Just how much did they know? There is a phenomenon called the precession of the equinoxes. It's a slow, wobbling motion of the Earth's axis, like a spinning top that is about to fall over. Because of this wobble, the North Star changes over time, and the constellation that rises behind the Sun on the spring equinox shifts backward by 1 degree every 72 years. It takes 25,920 years for the cycle to complete. It is a cycle so slow that a human being shouldn't be able to notice it in a single lifetime. It requires centuries of data collection to even spot the drift. Yet some historians and many alternative theorists argue that the Sumerians and the civilizations they influenced knew exactly what this number was. They point to the prevalence of the numbers 72, 2,160, and 43,200 in ancient myths and architecture, numbers that are mathematically locked into the precession cycle. Did they inherit this data? Did the Anunnaki tell them? Or were they just obsessive observers who maintained records over thousands of years, passing the data from teacher to student until the pattern emerged? If they did know about precession, it implies they understood the solar system on a mechanics level that rivals the Renaissance. It implies they knew the Earth was round, floating in space, and wobbling. But for the priest on the roof, this wasn't about physics. It was about survival. Astrology today is a joke in the back of a newspaper telling you that you'll meet a tall, dark stranger. For the Sumerians, it was national security. It was the CIA analysis of the divine will. If the moon was eclipsed, it meant the king was in danger. It was so serious that they developed a ritual called the substitute king. If the omens were bad for the monarch, the real king would abdicate for a few weeks. They would take a gardener or a prisoner, dress him in the royal robes, put him on the throne, and let him absorb the bad luck. The real king would hide in the palace, pretending to be a nobody. Once the danger passed, or the eclipse ended, the substitute king was, well, let's just say his employment was terminated permanently, and the real king went back to work. They looked at the sky and saw a mirror. As above, so below. The chaos of the heavens reflected the chaos of the earth. By reading the wild sheep, they hoped to predict the flood, the war, and the famine. But there was one thing they tracked that didn't move in a circle. One thing that didn't repeat every year. It was a list of names. A list that stretched back so far into the past that it blurred the line between history and fantasy. It is a document that breaks the timeline of human history. Now we arrive at the artifact that breaks the timeline. If you go to the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, England, you will find a small vertical prism made of baked clay. It stands about 8 inches tall and is covered on all 4 sides with dense, tiny cuneiform writing. It looks like a rolling pin that someone decided to write a novel on. This is the Weld Blundell Prism, better known as the Sumerian King List. At first glance, it seems like a standard bureaucratic document, a simple list of who ruled and for how long. But when you start reading the first column, you realize you are not looking at history as we understand it. You are looking at something that straddles the line between mythology and a different biological reality. The text begins with a sentence that sets the stage for the entire civilization. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. It confirms what we discussed earlier. The Sumerians believed government was an alien technology, a me lowered from the sky to the first city. But then, it lists the first ruler. In Eridu, Alulim became king. He ruled for 28,800 years. You pause. You reread the translation. Maybe it's a typo. Maybe it means days. But then you read the next entry. Alanga ruled for 36,000 years. It continues. Then Eridu fell, and the kingship was taken to Bad Tibira. There, Enmenluana ruled for 43,200 years. The list goes on, naming 8 kings in 5 cities who ruled for a grand total of 241,200 years. This is the antediluvian portion of the list, the kings before the flood. And these numbers drive historians crazy. Standard archaeology dismisses this as pure fiction. They argue that the Sumerian scribes were just trying to legitimize their current kings by inventing a glorious, impossible past. It's propaganda. Our current king is great because he descends from these immortal super beings. Others argue it's a math error. They suggest the scribes were playing games with the sexagesimal system, base 60, squaring numbers and multiplying by 60 to create sacred durations that weren't meant to be taken literally. But there is a third, more unsettling interpretation. What if the scribes were being accurate? What if the concept of time, or biology, was fundamentally different in the deep past? If we accept the ancient astronaut theory, even just as a thought experiment, these long reigns might refer to the Anunnaki themselves, beings with lifespans that would seem infinite to a human, or perhaps they refer to a time when the environment of Earth was radically different. Different atmosphere, different radiation levels, allowing for a biology that didn't decay as fast as ours. The text treats these numbers with the same dry, bureaucratic tone as the later entries. It doesn't say, he ruled for an eternity. It says, 28,800 years. It's specific. It's data. But then, the list stops abruptly. There is a break in the narrative. A line is drawn across history, separating the then from the now. The text reads, "Then the flood swept over." It is the most chilling sentence in the entire corpus of Sumerian literature. It implies a total reset, a hard formatting of the hard drive. And when the list resumes, the world has changed. After the flood had swept over, and the kingship had descended from heaven a second time, the kingship was in Kish. Notice the difference. The software of kingship had to be reinstalled. And look at the lifespans. The first king of the new dynasty, Joshua, rules for 1,200 years. That's still impossible by our standards, but it's a massive drop from 36,000. As the list continues, the numbers plummet. Etana, the shepherd who ascended to heaven, rules for 1,500 years. Lugalbanda, the father of Gilgamesh, rules for 1,200 years. Gilgamesh himself rules for 126 years. By the time we get to the kings, who we can historically verify with cross-referenced archaeology, like Enmebaragesi, the reigns are down to 30 years, 20 years, 10 years. They become human. This looks like a decay curve. It looks like a species that was once something else is slowly losing its potency. It implies that the blood of the gods, or the genetic perfection of the pre-flood era, is being diluted, generation by generation. We are fading. The Sumerians were painfully aware of this. They believed they were living in a dark age, a shadow of the glorious past. They looked at the ruins of the old cities and the stories of the 40,000-year kings and felt small. But the hinge of this entire history, the event that separates the immortals from the mortals, is the flood. We all know the story of Noah. We know the ark, the animals, the dove, and the olive branch. But the Sumerian king list was written at least 1,000 years before the Hebrew Bible took its final form. And when we dig deeper into the clay tablets, we find the original script of that catastrophe. We find the story of a man named Ziusudra, and a god who decided to betray his own counsel to save the seed of mankind. If you grew up in the Western world, the story of the Great Flood is probably part of your hard-coded cultural firmware. A bearded man, an ark, a parade of animals 2 by 2, and a rainbow at the end. It is a story of moral judgment. Humanity was wicked, so God hit the reset button. But if you dig into the clay beneath the biblical text, you find the original script. And let me tell you, the director's cut is darker, weirder, and far more bureaucratic. This is the Eridu Genesis, or the story of Ziusudra. In later Akkadian versions, he is called Utnapishtim, or Atrahasis, but it's the same guy. The basic beats are identical to the Bible, so much so that when George Smith first translated the tablet in the British Museum in 1872, he was so overcome with excitement that he began to undress in the middle of the room. He realized he was holding proof that the biblical narrative wasn't a unique revelation, but a retelling of a much older Sumerian memory. But the motivation for the apocalypse is completely different. In the Bible, God drowns the world because humans are sinful. We were killing each other, worshipping false idols, and generally being terrible. It was a moral cleansing. In the Sumerian version, the gods don't care about our morality. They care about our volume. According to the text, the human population had exploded. We were multiplying like rabbits, and the noise of our cities, the shouting, the banging, the bustling, was rising up to the heavens. The great god Enlil, the CEO of the pantheon, couldn't sleep. He literally calls a meeting and says, "The noise of mankind has become too intense for me. With their uproar, I am deprived of sleep." That's it. That's the reason for the genocide. It wasn't about sin. It was a noise complaint. Enlil decides to exterminate the human race simply because we were bad neighbors who played our music too loud. The Council of the Anunnaki votes. Enlil forces everyone to swear a blood oath that they will not warn a single human being. They are to die in ignorance. Enki, the god who created us, is horrified. He doesn't want his experiment destroyed, but he is bound by the oath. He cannot speak to a human. So he finds a loophole that would make a modern lawyer proud. Ziusudra, the king of Shuruppak, is a pious man who is standing by a reed wall, praying. Enki doesn't speak to Ziusudra. He speaks to the wall. "Wall, listen to me. Reed hut, pay attention. Tear down the house and build a boat. Abandon wealth and seek living beings. Spurn possessions and keep alive the living beings." Ziusudra, standing on the other side of the thin barrier, overhears the conversation the god is having with the architecture. He gets the message. The instructions for the boat are also terrifyingly specific. In the popular Sunday school version, Noah's Ark is a big wooden ship with a deck. In the Sumerian text, the boat is described more like a sealed capsule. Enki tells him to roof it over like the Apsu. It is to be a fully enclosed vessel, sealed inside and out with bitumen, black, sticky tar. It is essentially a submarine or a watertight survival bunker designed to tumble through chaotic waters. Ziusudra mobilizes his people. They butcher cattle for the workers. They flow beer into the jars, like river water, and they build this monstrosity. He loads his family, his gold. Interestingly, he saves his money too, and the seed of all living things. Then the weather changes. The description of the flood in the Epic of Gilgamesh, which retells this story, is one of the most visceral pieces of writing in human history. It describes a black cloud rising from the horizon. The storm god Adad bellows within it. The Anunnaki lift up their torches, lightning, setting the land ablaze. Then the dams of the nether waters shatter. The dikes collapse. The world turns to water. It is so violent that even the gods panic. The text says the Anunnaki were terrified by the deluge. They retreat to the highest heaven of Anu, cowering against the wall like dogs. Think about that image. The beings who engineered humanity, the lords of the universe, are huddled together, trembling, watching their creation get flushed away. For 6 days and 7 nights, the wind and the flood strike the land. The text says the storm flattened the land like a harrow. Silence settles over the world. When Ziusudra opens the hatch on the 7th day, he looks out. All of mankind had returned to clay. This line, "returned to clay," is heartbreakingly literal. Remember, in their myth, we were made of clay. The water simply dissolved us back into mud. The cycle was complete. Ziusudra releases a dove, then a swallow, then a raven. The raven finds land and doesn't return. The survivor steps out onto the muddy peak of Mount Nemush, or Ararat. He burns incense. The gods smell the sweet savor of the sacrifice and gather around like flies. They are hungry. They realize that by killing all the humans, they killed their own catering service. No humans means no offerings. Enlil arrives, furious that a human survived. But Enki steps in, smooth-talking as always. He argues that indiscriminate destruction is bad management. Punish the sinner for his sin, he argues, but do not wipe out the species. Enlil relents. In a rare moment of grace, he touches Ziusudra's forehead. But he doesn't let him return to society. He grants Ziusudra and his wife immortality and banishes them to live in the distance at the mouth of the rivers. They become living fossils, ghosts of the old world, separated from the new, diminished humanity that will slowly repopulate the earth. It's a gripping story, but for a long time, Historians assumed it was just that, a story, a metaphor for the unpredictable flooding of the Tigris and Euphrates. But then, in the 1920s, a British archaeologist named Leonard Woolley dug a deep hole in the ground near the ancient city of Ur. He went down through the debris of kings, through the pottery of the early dynastic period, and then he hit something that shouldn't have been there. He hit 8 feet of solid, clean, water-laid clay. Imagine you are Leonard Woolley. It is 1929, and you are standing at the bottom of a deep excavation pit in the ancient city of Ur. You are covered in dust, sweating in the Iraqi heat, and you are looking at the wall of dirt you've just cut through. You can read the history of the city in the layers like a club sandwich. At the top you have the bricks of the great kings. Below that, the debris of earlier settlements, broken pottery, ash, bones. But as your workmen dig deeper, trying to reach the bedrock of the very first settlement, the history suddenly stops. The pottery vanishes, the ash disappears. For 8 solid vertical feet, there is nothing but clean, water-laid clay. This is sterile soil. No human artifacts. No trash. Just pure mud that was deposited by water. Woolley is confused. He tells his workmen to keep digging. They go through the 8 feet of clay and suddenly, history restarts. Beneath the clay, they find the flint tools and painted pottery of a completely different, much older culture. Woolley climbs out of the pit, wipes his glasses, and sends a telegram that essentially says, "I found it. I found the flood." For a brief moment, the world went crazy. It seemed like scientific proof that the Bible and the Sumerian texts were historically accurate documentaries. But as with everything in archaeology, the truth is messier and more interesting. Here is the scientific evidence. We now know that there wasn't one single global flood that covered Mount Everest. Geologically, that's impossible. But there were massive, catastrophic inundations in this specific region that would have felt like the end of the world to the people living there. Remember the geography. Southern Iraq is a flat pancake. If you pour a glass of water on a tilted table, it runs off. If you pour it on a flat table, it spreads everywhere. Around 2900 BCE, distinct flood layers appear in the archaeological record of several major cities: Shuruppak, Ziusudra's hometown, Kish, and Uruk. The layer at Shuruppak is particularly thick. It suggests a perfect storm scenario. A year of record snowmelt from the Zagros Mountains surging down the rivers, colliding with a massive storm surge coming up from the Persian Gulf. The water would have had nowhere to go. It would have simply risen, turning the entire horizon into a single brown ocean. To a Sumerian standing on the roof of his mud brick house, the whole world was flooded. His world was the alluvial plain. He couldn't see the Alps or the Andes. He saw the water swallow the land as far as his eye could see. The edges of the earth had collapsed. And while this might have been a local geological event, the psychological scar it left was global. Before the flood, the Sumerian texts hint at a time when the connection between gods and men was closer, when rulers reigned for thousands of years and life was stable. After the flood, the vibe changes. The universe becomes hostile. You can feel this anxiety in their later prayers. They realized that the gods were not benevolent parents. They were capricious tyrants who could wipe out civilization because they had a headache. The flood proved that the social contract between man and God was flimsy. It created a cultural PTSD. Every time the river rose a few inches too high, panic would set in. Is it happening again? Did we make too much noise? This event created a hard before and after in their history. When a Sumerian scribe wrote a chronicle, he didn't use dates like 3000 BCE. He dated things relative to the catastrophe. These are the kings who ruled after the flood. It broke the continuity of time. It severed the link to the Golden Age. The knowledge of the ancients, the builders of the first Eridu, was largely lost, preserved only by the few me that Ziusudra managed to save on his boat. The civilization that re-emerged from the mud was different. It was harder. It was more aggressive. It was obsessed with building walls to keep the water and the barbarians out. And nowhere was this new, aggressive energy more visible than in the city that rose to take the lead in the post-flood world. We are going to Uruk, but not the Uruk of the gods. The Uruk of the first true superhero. If Eridu was the Vatican, a sacred, quiet place of origins, then Uruk was New York City. Welcome to the first true metropolis in human history. In the Bible, it is called Erech. To the Sumerians, it was simply the city. By 2900 BCE, while the rest of the world was largely living in small villages or nomadic bands, Uruk had exploded into a monster. We are talking about a population of 50,000 to 80,000 people crammed into an area of about 6 square kilometers. That might not sound like much today. It's a decent-sized football stadium crowd, but in the ancient world, it was a demographic singularity. It was a black hole of humanity that sucked in resources, people, and timber from hundreds of miles away. As you approach it across the plain, the first thing that hits you isn't the smell, though that is intense. It's the wall. Sumerian cities were usually surrounded by simple mud ramparts, easily washed away or climbed over. But Uruk is ringed by a massive fortification of baked brick. Remember, baking bricks in a kiln requires expensive fuel, wood or dung, that you have to import or gather. To build a wall this size out of baked brick is a flex of unimaginable wealth. It says, "We are not just hiding, we are permanent." Later poets would attribute this wall to the legendary king Gilgamesh, urging visitors to walk on the wall of Uruk. Inspect the foundation terrace and examine the brickwork. Is it not burnt brick? Once you pass through the gates, you are assaulted by a level of sensory chaos that the human brain wasn't really designed to handle yet. For the first time in history, you are walking among strangers. In a village, you know everyone's name, their parents, and their dog. Here, you are anonymous. You pass faces you will never see again. This density creates a new kind of psychological pressure, the need for signals, for fashion, for status symbols to tell people who you are without speaking. The city is strictly zoned. The ancient texts actually give us a breakdown of the urban planning. 1 square mile of city, 1 square mile of date groves, 1 square mile of clay pit, and half a square mile of the Temple of Ishtar. It's a mix of the industrial, the residential, and the divine. You walk past the Temple of Heaven district, where the ziggurat of Anu rises in white gypsum. Then you enter the Inana district, the precinct of Inana, the goddess of love and war. This is the beating heart of the city, a complex of warehouses, workshops, and shrines that functions like a cross between a cathedral and the Federal Reserve. But look at the people working here. This is where the true revolution of Uruk lies. It's not in the bricks, it's in the jobs. In the old days, everyone was a generalist. You farmed, you built your house, you made your clothes. In Uruk, that is impossible. The society has become so complex that you have to specialize. We have found lists, the standard professions list, that read like a directory of guild members. There are specific words for snake charmer, perfume maker, goldsmith, brewer, weaver, and prostitute. There is even a distinction between a scribe who counts land and a scribe who counts military rations. You are no longer just a human being. You are your function. You are a cog in the machine. This is the birth of the career, and with it the birth of class anxiety. The incredible density of Uruk also forces the invention of something else: the police. When you pack 50,000 people into mud brick alleyways, crime skyrockets. We see the first evidence of watchmen and courts of law. We see the first contracts that try to regulate behavior between strangers. If a man rents a donkey and breaks its leg, who pays? If a house collapses on the neighbor's wall, who is liable? The city forced them to invent civil law because custom wasn't enough anymore. But there is a dark side to this density. Uruk was a biological hazard. Paleopathologists, scientists who study ancient diseases, have looked at the bones from this period. They find evidence of what they call the urban penalty. People in the cities were actually shorter and less healthy than the hunter-gatherers outside the walls. They had more cavities from all that barley and dates, more anemia, and more signs of infectious disease. Living in Uruk meant living in a petri dish. There was no sewage system, just open drains and cesspits. The water supply was constantly at risk of contamination. But people stayed. They flocked here. Why? Because Uruk was exciting. It was the only place on Earth where you could get imported wine, see a festival with 10,000 singers, or buy a cylinder seal made of stone from India. It was the center of the world. Historians still argue about how this massive organism was governed. Was it a temple state ruled by a priest-king, En, who managed the resources in the name of the god? Or was there a secular assembly of elders that checked his power? The evidence is murky, but it seems to shift over time from a religious bureaucracy to a military monarchy. And the man who represents that shift, the man who supposedly built those walls and bullied this chaotic city into greatness, is the first personality in history who feels real to us. He isn't a god. He isn't a myth. He is a bad boss, a terrible friend, and a king who is terrified of dying. Walking the streets of Uruk, you can feel the vibration of the city, the energy, the aggression, the sheer scale of it. And if you ask anyone who built this place, they won't point to a committee of architects. They will point to one man, a man who is 2/3 god, 1/3 human, and 100% a problem. Gilgamesh. For a long time, historians treated Gilgamesh like King Arthur or Hercules, a purely mythological figure invented to entertain the masses. But then, they started reading the receipts. They found his name on the Sumerian king list. Gilgamesh, whose father was a phantom, the lord of Kulaba, ruled for 126 years. Then they found inscriptions from other kings, like Enmebaragesi of Kish, who is a confirmed historical figure, claiming to have fought wars against him. So the consensus now is that Gilgamesh was real. He likely ruled Uruk around 2700 BCE. But the real Gilgamesh wasn't the noble hero you see in movies. If you read the opening of his epic, he sounds like a nightmare to work for. He is described as a tyrant who does not leave a girl to her mother, invoking the right of prima nocta, and who works his young men to death, building his massive walls. The people of Uruk actually pray to the gods to send a distraction just to get him off their backs. And the gods deliver. They send Enkidu. Enkidu is the anti-Gilgamesh. He is the wild man, covered in hair, living in the steppe, running with the gazelles and smashing hunters' traps. He represents the pre-civilized past, the hunter-gatherer world that Sumer left behind. The story of their meeting is arguably the first buddy-cop dynamic in literature. They fight to a standstill, realize they are equals, and become inseparable. They go on adventures, killing the guardian of the cedar forest, Humbaba, and insulting the goddess Inana. It's high-octane action. But then the story takes a sharp, dark turn. This isn't just an adventure story. It is the first recorded existential crisis in human history. The gods decide that for killing Humbaba and the Bull of Heaven, one of the heroes must die. They choose Enkidu. Gilgamesh watches his best friend waste away. He sits by the body for 7 days and 7 nights, refusing to believe it, until, and the text is brutally graphic here, a maggot fell from his nose. That is the moment the psychological wall breaks. Gilgamesh, the king of Uruk, the builder of the great ramparts, realizes that he is just meat. All his power, all his walls, all his me cannot stop the rot. He panics. He abandons his throne. He throws away his royal robes, puts on a lion's skin, and runs into the wilderness. He isn't looking for treasure. He is looking for the cure for death. His target is Utnapishtim, the Akkadian name for Ziusudra, the flood survivor we met earlier. Gilgamesh knows this old man lives at the mouth of the rivers and holds the secret to eternal life. The journey is surreal. He passes through a tunnel of total darkness, the path of the sun at night. Meets Siduri, the ale wife, who tells him to just go home, drink beer, and enjoy his life. Essentially the first carpe diem speech. And finally crosses the waters of death to find the old man. When he finally meets the immortal Utnapishtim, the result is a massive anticlimax. The old man doesn't give him a magic potion. Instead, he challenges him. If you want to conquer death, Utnapishtim says, try conquering sleep first. Stay awake for 7 days and 7 nights. It's a brilliant test. Sleep is the little death. If you can't even stop your consciousness from shutting down for a week, how can you expect to stop it forever? Gilgamesh sits down and immediately falls asleep. He sleeps for 7 days. Utnapishtim even has his wife bake a loaf of bread for every day he sleeps, placing them in a circle around his head. When Gilgamesh wakes up and claims, "I only dozed off for a second," the old man points to the moldy bread. It's a humiliating failure. But because Utnapishtim pities him, he gives him a consolation prize. He tells him about a prickly plant at the bottom of the ocean that restores youth. Not immortality, but you will be young again. Gilgamesh dives into the abyss, tying rocks to his feet to sink, a technique pearl divers in the Gulf used until recently, and retrieves the plant. He has it. He has the technology to cheat aging. He heads back to Uruk, but on the way, he stops to bathe in a cool pool of water. He leaves the plant on the bank. While he is swimming, a snake smells the plant. It slithers out of a hole, eats the flower, and immediately sheds its skin, slithering away, fresh and new. Gilgamesh comes out of the water to find the plant gone, and the old snake skin lying in the dust. He sits down and weeps. This is the punchline of the entire Sumerian worldview. The snake achieved the rejuvenation that the king wanted. Why? Because nature cycles. Nature sheds its skin and renews. Humans do not. We are linear. We go from clay to dust, and we don't come back. Gilgamesh returns to Uruk empty-handed, but the ending of the epic is profound. He stands by the gates of the city, the same gates you walked through. He looks at the baked brick. He looks at the foundations. He turns to his scribe and says, essentially, "Look at this work. It is good." He realizes that he cannot live forever in his body. But his work, the structure of the city, the civilization he defended, will outlast him. His immortality is the text itself. This is the hard wisdom of Sumer. You will die. Your friends will die. But if you build something strong enough, out of hard, baked clay, your name might survive the flood. But while Gilgamesh was building walls and chasing immortality, the average person in Uruk was worried about something much more immediate. They weren't worried about living forever. They were worried about lunch. And specifically, they were worried about their beer. Let's leave Gilgamesh weeping at the city gates and walk into the narrow, twisting alleyways where the real people live. The kings might be obsessed with immortality, but for the 50,000 regular citizens of Uruk, the daily obsession is calorie maintenance. If you were to sit down for dinner with a Sumerian family in 2500 BCE, your first impression would be beige. The Sumerian civilization was powered almost entirely by barley. They grew wheat, emmer, but the soil of southern Iraq was becoming increasingly saline due to centuries of irrigation, and wheat hates salt. Barley is tougher. It can tolerate the saltier earth. So slowly, the Sumerian diet shifted until it was about 80% barley. You would eat barley bread, unleavened, dense, and gritty. Sand from the grinding stones often got mixed in, wearing your teeth down by age 30. You would eat barley porridge. And most importantly, you would drink barley. Water in the ancient world was a gamble. The river was full of silt, sewage, and parasites. Drinking straight from the Euphrates was a good way to die of dysentery before the harvest. So, they processed the water. They boiled it, mashed it with malted grain, fermented it, and created cash, beer. But forget your modern idea of a crisp, clear lager. Sumerian beer was a different beast entirely. It was opaque, room temperature, and thick, more like a fermented liquid gruel than a beverage. It was rich in protein and carbohydrates, essentially liquid bread. It was so full of grain husks and floating debris that you couldn't just tilt a cup and drink it. If you did, you'd get a mouthful of sludge. That is why, when you look at Sumerian cylinder seals depicting banquet scenes, you see people sitting around a large communal jar sipping through long reed tubes. They invented the drinking straw not for convenience, but for filtration. If you were rich, your straw might be made of gold and lapis lazuli. If you were poor, it was just a reed. But everyone drank it. Men, women, and children. It was the primary source of hydration and nutrition, low in alcohol, but high in vitamins. They loved it so much, they had a goddess dedicated to it. Ninkasi. We actually have a hymn to Ninkasi, which is quite literally a recipe for brewing. You are the one who handles the dough with a big shovel. You are the one who soaks the malt in a jar. It's a divine instruction manual for getting a buzz. But how did you pay for this beer? You didn't have coins. Coins wouldn't be invented for another 2,000 years. In Lydia, you were paid in rations. And this brings us to one of the most unglamorous but significant archaeological finds in history. If you dig anywhere in the Uruk layer, from Turkey to Iran, you will find thousands upon thousands of ugly, roughly made clay bowls. They look like flower pots that a kindergartner made. They are called beveled rim bowls. They were mass-produced in molds, millions of them, all roughly the same size. They are the styrofoam cups of antiquity. Archaeologists believe these were the standard unit of payment. You worked a day hauling bricks for the temple, you got 1 beveled rim bowl's worth of barley. You worked a specialized job, maybe you got 2 bowls. It represents a centrally planned economy, where the state, the temple, decided exactly how much food you needed to survive, measured it out in a disposable cup, and handed it to you. It's a stark reminder that for the vast majority of people, civilization meant becoming a wage laborer dependent on the state for your daily bread. As you sit there dipping your bread in onion soup, they loved onions, garlic, and leeks. The breath of Sumer must have been potent. Look at what the people are wearing. In the early period, the fashion is fuzzy. You see men wearing skirts that look like layers of leaves or feathers. This is the kaunakis. It's actually sheepskin with the wool still attached, layered so the tufts hang down like shingles. It looks hot, heavy, and incredibly itchy. Later, as they mastered the loom, they switched to woven wool cloth. Wool was the oil of the Sumerian economy. They had vast herds of sheep, millions of them, grazing in the steppe lands. They converted grass into wool, wove the wool into high-quality textiles, and exported it to places like India and Anatolia to buy the things they didn't have: wood, stone, metal. And if you want to fit in, pay attention to your eyebrows. In Sumerian art, the ideal beauty standard involved thick, heavy eyebrows that met in the middle. The unibrow wasn't a grooming error. It was a sign of vitality and power. If you didn't have one naturally, you might paint it on with kohl. Now let's look at the house itself. You are sitting in a courtyard. The Sumerian house was an introvert. It turned its back on the street. The outer walls were blank mud brick with no windows. This kept out the dust, the heat, and the prying eyes of the neighbors. Everything faced inward to an open-air central court. This acted as a ventilation shaft. As the hot air rose out of the courtyard, it pulled cooler air from the thick-walled rooms below. It's a brilliant piece of passive thermal engineering that is still used in Middle Eastern architecture today. But in July, when the temperature in southern Iraq hits 50 degrees Celsius, 122 degrees Fahrenheit, even the thickest walls can't save you. So, at night, the entire family would grab their woven mats and head up the stairs to the roof. Imagine the city at night. Thousands of families sleeping on their flat roofs under the stars. You can hear the murmur of conversations drifting across the alleyways. You can hear the crying of babies, the barking of stray dogs, and the chanting of the night watch priests from the distant temple. It is a moment of peace. But for the children of the wealthy, the morning brings a terror that is timeless. They don't have to go to the fields to harvest barley. They have to go to a place much scarier. They have to go to school. The sun hasn't even cleared the horizon yet, but you are already awake. Your mother packs you a lunch, 2 rolls of bread, and you sprint out the door. You are running because you are late. And if you are late, you are going to bleed. Welcome to the Aduba, literally the tablet house. This is the Sumerian school. If you thought your school experience was harsh, prepare yourself. The Aduba is a place of rigid discipline, endless repetition, and physical punishment. It is designed to take wild, playful children and crush them into the perfect bureaucratic molds needed to run the empire. You rush into the courtyard and sit in your designated spot on the ground. You are a son of the tablet house. Your teacher is called the Ummiya, or school father. But the person you are most afraid of is a man who holds a very specific official title, the man with the whip. His job description is exactly what it sounds like. If you talk out of turn, whip. If you stand up without permission, whip. If your handwriting is sloppy, whip. We know this because we have found the homework. We have found thousands of exercise tablets with the shaky, uncertain handwriting of children on one side and the crisp, perfect calligraphy of the teacher on the other. And we have found a specific text, a sort of satirical autobiography called School Days, that describes a day in the life of a Sumerian student. It reads like a teenager's diary entry from hell. "I went to the tablet house," the student writes. "I recited my tablet, I ate my lunch, I prepared my new tablet, I wrote it, I finished it. But then, the day goes wrong. The overseer said to me, 'Why are you staring about?' He beat me. The silence monitor said, 'Why did you talk?' He beat me. The teacher said, 'Your hand is not good.' He beat me. In a single day, the poor kid gets beaten 7 times. He goes home, traumatized, and tells his father, 'I hate the scribal art. I want to quit.' The father, knowing that being a scribe is the only ticket to a good life, decides to intervene. But he doesn't go to the school to complain about the abuse. He goes to bribe the teacher. He invites the Ummiyah to his house for a fancy dinner. He gives him fine beer, dresses him in a new robe, and slips a ring on his finger. Suddenly, the teacher's attitude changes completely. He turns to the student and says, 'Young man, because you have not neglected my words, may you reach the pinnacle of the scribal art. May you be the leader of your brothers.' It's a hilarious, cynical, and deeply human moment. It shows that 4,000 years ago, the education system was already a mix of hard work and knowing whose palm to grease. But what were they actually learning? The curriculum was brutal. It wasn't about creative writing. It was about data entry. You would spend years just memorizing lists. We have found these lexical lists. They are essentially dictionaries without definitions. A list of every type of tree. A list of every type of stone. A list of every god. A list of every body part. You had to memorize thousands of signs. Remember, cuneiform isn't an alphabet with 26 letters. It's a syllabary with hundreds of complex shapes. An looks like a star. Ki looks like a diamond. You had to learn how to make the clay tablet itself, kneading it to the right consistency so it wouldn't crack. If your clay was too dry, the signs would be faint. If it was too wet, they would mush together. But if you survived the beatings, the boredom, and the clay-chapped hands, you graduated into a class of humans that was effectively a different species. You became a dubzar, a scribe. In a world of 99% illiteracy, the scribe was a wizard. You were the only one who could read the old laws. You were the only one who could write a contract. You were the only one who could send a letter to a general on the frontier. Kings needed you. Priests needed you. Merchants needed you. There is a Sumerian proverb that says, "The scribe is the tongue of the city." Without you, the city is mute. You could rise to become a high administrator, running the economy of an entire province. You could become a diplomat. Or you could enter the most secretive and dangerous profession of all. You could become a doctor. But in Sumer, medicine wasn't just about bandages and herbs. It was about fighting the invisible monsters that were eating the patient from the inside out. So despite the garlic, the beer, and the prayers, you get sick. You wake up one morning with a pounding headache, a fever that makes your skin feel like baked clay, and a sharp pain in your chest. In 2025, you would pop an ibuprofen and call in sick. In 2500 BCE, you are in mortal danger. But you have options. You send a runner to the temple district to hire a professional. 2 men show up at your door. They look at each other with a professional rivalry that has lasted for 5,000 years. One is the Asu. He is the physician. He carries a bag full of bandages, copper scalpels, and jars of herbs. He is the pharmacist of the ancient world. He deals in the physical reality of the body. The other is the Ashipu. He is the exorcist. He carries a staff, a censer of incense, and a collection of terrifying amulets. He deals in the spiritual reality of the body. To understand Sumerian medicine, you have to understand that for them, there was no difference between these two realities. They didn't know what a bacteria or a virus was. If you were sick, it wasn't because of germs. It was because something, or someone, had invaded you. You didn't catch a cold. You were seized by the hand of a ghost. You didn't have a stroke. You were slapped by the hand of a god. So the diagnosis begins. The Ashipu takes the lead. He doesn't check your blood pressure. He asks you what sins you committed lately. Did you insult a god? Did you step on a cursed object? Did you fail to offer a libation to your dead ancestors? He looks at the omens. He might even look at a sheep's liver to see if the gods are angry with you. This obsession with the liver, hepatoscopy, is one of the weirdest and most persistent features of Mesopotamian science. To us, the heart is the seat of emotion, and the brain is the seat of thought. To the Sumerians, the liver was the battery of life. It was the heavy, bloody organ that filtered the soul. They made detailed clay models of livers, mapping out the zones of the organ like a terrain map to read the will of the gods. If the Ashipu determines that you have been possessed by a Giddim, a wandering ghost, he starts the incantations. He burns strong-smelling incense to smoke the demon out. He might tie knots in a rope and then cut them, symbolically severing the ghost's hold on you. He might even employ a scapegoat, literally taking a goat, transferring your sickness into the animal through a ritual, and sending it out into the desert to die. While the exorcist is shouting at the invisible demons, the Asu gets to work on your physical symptoms. And here is where things get surprisingly scientific. We have found medical tablets that are essentially prescription pads. They list ingredients that we still recognize today as having medicinal value. They used salt, antiseptic, saltpeter, astringent, turtle shell, calcium, and milk. They used honey, which we now know is a powerful antibacterial agent for dressing wounds. They used opium, the joy plant, for pain relief. Here is an actual recipe for a poultice from a 4,000-year-old tablet. Pulverize the seed of the carpenter plant, the gum of the markazi plant, and thyme. Dissolve in beer. Let the man drink. Beer, once again, is the universal solvent. But the Asu didn't just mix potions. He was a surgeon. The Code of Hammurabi, which codified earlier Sumerian laws, lists the fees for surgery and the penalties for failure. If a physician performs a major operation on a seigneur with a bronze lancet and saves the seigneur's life, he shall receive 10 shekels of silver. That's a lot of money. A year's wages for a laborer. But the next line is chilling. If he performs a major operation on a seigneur with a bronze lancet and causes the seigneur's death, they shall cut off his hand. This high-stakes malpractice law meant that doctors were very, very careful. They likely only operated when they were sure of success, or when the patient was desperate. It created a profession that was conservative, practical, and deeply intertwined with the legal system. But let's say the Asu's poultice works. The fever breaks. You feel better. Who gets the credit? Not the Asu. He was just the mechanic. The credit goes to the goddess Gula, the patron of healing. often depicted with a dog, because the Sumerians noticed that dog saliva seemed to heal wounds. And the credit goes to the Ashipu for successfully bullying the demon into leaving your body. This worldview, that the air is thick with invisible, malicious entities looking for a host, made life in Sumer psychologically exhausting. You were never just alone. You were always surrounded by the unseen. The wind wasn't just air. It was a carrier of spirits. The night wasn't just dark. It was a cloak for things that wanted to eat your life force. And among these invisible threats, there was one category of being that terrified the Sumerians more than anything else. It wasn't a god. It wasn't a monster. It was the neighbor you buried last week. As the sun sets over the ziggurat, the mood of the city changes. The gates are barred. The markets empty out. People retreat into their windowless houses and bar the doors. In the modern world, we are afraid of the dark because we can't see. In ancient Sumer, they were afraid of the dark because of what they could see, or at least what they sensed standing in the corner of the room. The Sumerian night was crowded. If you walk down a dark alley in Uruk, you aren't just avoiding thieves, you are avoiding the Giddim. The Giddim are the ghosts of the dead, but they aren't the translucent, wailing spirits of Victorian ghost stories. They are hungry, desperate shadows. In the Sumerian belief system, death wasn't a release. It was a demotion. When you died, your spirit went to the netherworld, but your shade could linger on Earth if, and this is the crucial part, your family forgot you. This created a society built on guilt and obligation. If you didn't pour fresh water and offer food scraps at your family's tomb, often buried right under the floor of your living room, every single month, Grandma would get thirsty. And a thirsty ghost is a dangerous ghost. They would crawl up from the cracks in the earth to inflict sickness, bad luck, or just stand over your bed and scream. But ghosts were the least of your worries. The real terror came from the demons. Sumerian demons weren't fallen angels. They were the offspring of the older gods, or personifications of natural disasters. They were the wind that dries up the crops, the fever that burns the skin, the silence that kills the infant. And the most feared of them all was a female demon named Lamashtu. Lamashtu is the nightmare of the ancient nursery. She is depicted with the head of a lion, the teeth of a donkey, naked breasts and hairy body, holding snakes in her hands. She wasn't a servant of the gods. She was a rogue agent. Her entire existence was dedicated to slipping into houses at night and strangling babies in their cribs, or causing miscarriages in pregnant women. She represents the terrifying reality of high infant mortality in the ancient world. When a baby died suddenly in the night, it wasn't SIDS, it was Lamashtu. So how do you fight a monster like that? You can't pray to the nice gods. They are too far away. You need a monster of your own. You need Pazuzu. You probably know Pazuzu. He is the demon made famous by the movie The Exorcist. In Hollywood, he is the villain. But in Sumer, he was the anti-hero. Pazuzu is the king of the evil wind demons. He has a dog-like face, bulging eyes, 4 wings, scaly skin, and a scorpion tail. He looks absolutely horrific. But if you excavate a Sumerian bedroom, you will often find a small statue of Pazuzu standing guard in the corner, or an amulet of his face hanging around a pregnant woman's neck. Why? Because Pazuzu hates Lamashtu. The logic was simple. I will invite the king of demons into my house, because even the baby killer is afraid of the king. It was a protection racket. You used one demon to scare away the others. It's a profound psychological insight, fighting fire with fire. But even if you survive the demons and the ghosts, you eventually have to face the ultimate destination. You have to go to Kur. The Sumerian afterlife is one of the most depressing concepts ever invented by the human imagination. There was no heaven. There were no Elysian fields. There was no judgment day where the good were rewarded and the bad were punished. There was only the house of dust. When you died, you descended into a deep, dark cavern beneath the earth. In this place, the texts say, "Dust is their food, and clay is their meat." Everyone is dressed in feathers like birds. They sit in eternal darkness, eating dirt and drinking muddy water. It didn't matter if you were a king or a slave. It didn't matter if you were a saint or a murderer. Gilgamesh ends up in the same dusty gloom as the guy who cleaned his stables. The only difference is that the king might get a slightly better table and cool water, if, and only if, his living sons keep pouring water into his grave. This grim equality meant that life now was everything. You had to enjoy your beer, love your spouse, and wear your nice clothes today, because tomorrow you would be eating clay. This fear of the dark permeated their sleep habits. Sleep was viewed as a temporary journey to the borders of Kur. When you dream, your soul is wandering in the borderlands. If you have a nightmare, it's because a demon is pressing on your chest. This is why they slept with apotropaic, evil-averting figurines buried under the floorboards, clay dogs, fishmen, or warrior heroes, to create a magical perimeter around the bed. But there was one group of people in Sumer who had a different relationship with the gods. One group that could actually own property, run businesses, and even challenge the kings, despite the fact that history usually writes them out of the narrative. We need to talk about the women of Sumer, and specifically, the woman who signed her name to a piece of literature 1,000 years before Homer was even born. We often look back at the ancient world and assume it was a monolith of patriarchy, a long, unbroken timeline where women were silent, invisible, and owned by their husbands. And while it's true that the ancient Near East wasn't exactly a feminist utopia, if you zoom in on early Sumer, you find a surprise. You find women running businesses. You find women initiating divorce. And most importantly, you find a woman holding the pen that wrote history. In the early dynastic period, before the heavy militarization of the later empires, the gender divide in Sumer was surprisingly permeable. We have legal documents showing women owning property independent of their husbands. We have records of women acting as witnesses in court, something that would be illegal in enlightened Athens 2,000 years later. We even have recipes for beer left by female brewers who ran their own taverns. But the ultimate proof of female power in Sumer comes in the form of a limestone disc found at Ur. It depicts a woman in a flounced robe, wearing a rolled brim hat, leading a procession of priests. She looks calm, authoritative, and utterly in charge. This is Enheduanna, and you should know her name because she is the first named author in all of human history. Not the first female author, the first author, period. Before her, writing was anonymous. Scribes were just recording machines for the state. They wrote, "The king did this," or "the god said that." They never used the word I. They never signed their work. Enheduanna changed that. She was the daughter of Sargon of Akkad, the world's first emperor, who appointed her as the high priestess of the moon god, Nana, in the city of Ur. It was a political move to unify the rebellious Sumerian south with the Akkadian north. But Enheduanna didn't just serve as a figurehead. She was a theological genius. She took the disparate, confusing pantheon of Sumerian gods and organized them into a coherent system through her temple hymns. But her masterpiece is a poem called The Exaltation of Inana. This isn't a dry prayer. It is a visceral, angry, and deeply personal memoir. She writes about being driven into exile by a usurper named Lugal-Ane. She describes her trauma. She describes walking through the thorny brush of the desert, stripped of her office. "I am Enheduanna," she writes. "My mouth is filled with venom. My voice is a terrifying lion." Read that again. "I am Enheduanna." That is the moment the individual voice was born in literature. She speaks of her own suffering, her own rage, and her own eventual restoration by the goddess Inana. She compares the creative process of writing poetry to childbirth. That which I have given birth to, no one has ever created before. She was so famous that her works were copied by student scribes for 500 years after her death. If you were learning to write in Babylon centuries later, you were copying the words of Enheduanna. But she wasn't the only powerful woman. In the city of Separ, there was an entire district called the Gargum. This was a cloister, a walled community of women known as the Naditu. The Naditu were essentially nuns. They were dedicated to the sun god, Shamash, and were not allowed to have children. But unlike the nuns of medieval Europe, the Naditu were not sworn to poverty. Far from it. They were the venture capitalists of the ancient world. Because they had no heirs to drain their resources, these women accumulated massive amounts of capital. We have thousands of tablets from the Gagum showing that they were aggressively buying and selling land, lending silver at interest, and financing trade expeditions. They were so powerful that even the kings borrowed money from them. Imagine a walled convent in the middle of the city that functioned as the central bank. If you needed a loan to buy a herd of sheep, you didn't go to a male merchant. You went to the Gargum and negotiated with a Naditu. There are letters between these women and their families that are wonderfully mundane. "Why have you not sent the silver? The price of barley has dropped. Sell now." They were active, literate, and financially independent. So what happened? Why does the history books usually skip this chapter? As the centuries ground on, the Sumerian culture was slowly absorbed by the Amorites, the Babylonians, and finally the Assyrians. The political climate shifted from a collection of city-states to massive, aggressive empires. War became the constant state of being. As society became more militarized, the status of women plummeted. The logic is brutal but simple. In a society constantly at war, physical strength and the ability to produce soldier sons become the primary values. The laws changed. By the time of the Middle Assyrian laws, around 1075 BCE, the rights of women had been almost completely erased. Women were legally required to be veiled in public, the first recorded veiling laws in history. They could be beaten or mutilated by their husbands for minor offenses without legal repercussion. They were stripped of their property rights. The Naditu disappeared. The voice of Enheduanna was silenced, her tablets buried in the sand, not to be read again for 3,000 years. The open, somewhat egalitarian mud-brick courtyards of early Sumer gave way to the locked harems of Babylon. It is a tragic reminder that progress is not a straight line. Societies can go backward, rights can be lost. But even as the social structure hardened, the Sumerians continued to innovate in the one area that required no mercy, only math and metal. They turned their attention to the art of killing, and they created a weapon that would change the face of warfare forever. As the population of Sumer swelled and the cities expanded, the empty space between them disappeared. Suddenly, the fields of Uruk were bumping up against the fields of Ur. The herds of Lagash were drinking from the same canal as the herds of Umma. And in a landscape where water is the only thing that matters, sharing is not an option. We tend to think of the first wars as chaotic brawls, mobs of men hitting each other with clubs. But if you look at the archaeological record of 2450 BCE, you see something chillingly disciplined. You see the invention of the military machine. To witness this, we have to look at one of the most violent and honest pieces of art ever carved, the Stele of Vultures. It is a limestone monument commissioned by Eannatum, the king of Lagash, to celebrate his victory over the neighboring city of Umma. The two cities had been fighting for generations over a fertile strip of land called the Gu Edin, the edge of the plain. Look closely at the carving. You don't see individual heroes swinging swords like in a Hollywood movie. You see a solid block of men. They are standing shoulder to shoulder, hiding behind a wall of rectangular shields. Bristling out from between the shields are rows of long spears. This is the phalanx. Historians still argue whether this artistic depiction represents a literal tactical formation or a symbolic unity. But if it is literal, it means the Sumerians invented the phalanx 2,000 years before the Greeks. This formation requires immense discipline. It requires drill. It requires a soldier to suppress his instinct to run, and instead trust the man standing next to him. It turns a crowd into a tank. Imagine standing on that dusty plain as the phalanx of Lagash advances. You hear the rhythmic thump of sandals, the clatter of copper spears against wood. It is a slow, grinding wall of death. And walking at the head of this formation is the king. But he isn't just wearing a cloth turban anymore. He is wearing a helmet made of copper, hammered to fit his skull, with a chin strap and ear guards. This is the dawn of the arms race. The moment someone invented a copper mace capable of crushing a skull, someone else had to invent a copper helmet to deflect it. The moment someone invented the composite bow, a piece of high-tech engineering made of wood, horn, and sinew glued together, someone else had to invent the armored cloak. But to the Sumerian soldier, the spear and the shield were just tools. The real weapon was the god. When Lagash fought Umma, it wasn't just Eannatum fighting the king of Umma. It was the god Ningirsu fighting the god Shara. The soldiers were merely the avatars of this cosmic wrestling match. On the other side of the Stele of Vultures, we see the god Ningirsu holding a massive net. Inside the net are the tangled, naked bodies of the enemies. He is clubbing them casually, like a fisherman dealing with a bad catch. This concept, the net of Enlil, was a terrifying psychological weapon. Sumerians believed that when a city was defeated, it wasn't because their tactics failed. It was because their own god had abandoned them, or because the enemy god had cast a magical net over them that paralyzed their will to fight. And what happened if you were caught in that net? If you were lucky, you died on the battlefield. The stele gets its name from the gruesome depiction of vultures swirling over the corpses, carrying off severed heads and arms. It is a graphic warning. This is what happens to people who steal our water. If you were unlucky, you survived. The Sumerian word for mountain is Kur. The word for woman is Munus. When you combine them, you get the sign for slave girl, literally woman from the mountains. Slavery in Sumer wasn't usually based on race. It was based on bad luck. It was the result of debt or war. If your city lost, you became chattel. You were branded, your hair was shaved in a specific humiliating pattern, and you were put to work grinding grain or digging canals until you dropped. We have found fetters, bronze shackles, sized for ankles. We have found tablets listing slaves by name, age, and price, right next to the price of cows and copper ingots. It is the industrialization of human misery. But the constant warfare did something else. It accelerated technology. Bronze, the alloy of copper and tin, is stronger than pure copper. But tin is rare. You can't find it in Iraq. You have to get it from Afghanistan, or maybe even as far away as Cornwall or Spain. To build a better sword, the Sumerians had to build a better trade network. The hunger for metal forced them to explore the world. It pushed their merchants into the Indus Valley, Meluha, and into the mountains of Anatolia. War made the world smaller, but as the armies grew and the walls got higher, the people of Sumer began to realize that their greatest enemy wasn't the city next door. It wasn't even the demon in the dark. It was the very thing they had built their civilization on. It was the ziggurat itself, or rather, the hubris it represented. They were reaching too high. And in their stories, they preserved a warning about what happens when you try to build a staircase to the level of the gods. If you ask a child to draw ancient Egypt, they will draw a triangle. The pyramid is the ultimate symbol of the Nile, a tomb designed to seal a dead king inside a mountain of stone. But if you ask a child to draw ancient Sumer, they should draw a staircase. You are standing before the great ziggurat of Ur. It dominates the skyline, a massive rectangular mountain rising from the flat plains. But unlike the Egyptian pyramids, which were smooth, white, and inaccessible, this structure invites you to climb. It is a series of stacked platforms, getting smaller as they rise, connected by monumental staircases that look like they were designed for giants. This is not a tomb. There is no dead body hidden inside. In fact, the core of the ziggurat is solid dirt. The engineering required to keep this thing standing is mind-bending. Sumer is a land of mud, so the core is millions of sun-dried mud bricks. But if you just piled mud bricks that high, the weight would crush the bottom layers, and any moisture trapped inside would cause the whole thing to slump into a shapeless blob. So the architects came up with a solution that rivals modern skyscrapers. They faced the entire structure with a thick shell of baked bricks, fired in kilns until they were as hard as rock. They set these bricks not in mortar, but in bitumen, that sticky, black, waterproof tar that bubbles up from the ground in this region. But here is the genius part. They built weeper holes into the walls. If you look closely at the brickwork, you will see deep, square shafts penetrating the core. These allowed the moisture from the winter rains to evaporate out of the mud core. They effectively built a breathing machine. The ziggurat you are looking at, built by King Ur-Nammu around 2100 BCE, is a masterpiece of optical illusion. The walls aren't straight. They curve slightly outward to prevent the visual impression that the building is falling over. It's the same trick the Greeks would use on the Parthenon nearly 2,000 years later. But why build it? Why spend millions of man-hours piling dirt in the desert? Because the gods live on the mountain. And since Sumer is flat, you have to build the mountain yourself. The ziggurat was a bond of heaven and earth, Duranki. It was essentially an antenna. The temple at the very top, the Shakuru, or waiting room, wasn't for humans. It was a landing pad. The priests believed that the god would physically descend from the sky, walk down the stairs, and inhabit the statue in the lower temple to eat his dinner. The ziggurat wasn't built for you to get closer to God. It was built to lure God closer to you. It was a cosmic hospitality trap. Imagine the structure in its prime. Today, the ruins are a dusty brown. But back then, the lower levels were likely painted black, representing the underworld bitumen, The middle red, the earth, and the top shrine was covered in blue glazed tiles to blend with the sky. The dome might have been plated in gold. And it wasn't just bare brick. Terraces were planted with trees and shrubs irrigated by complex water-lifting machines. When the wind blew, the ziggurat would have rustled. It was a vertical garden, a green mountain shimmering in the heat haze. Many historians believe this was the real inspiration for the Hanging Gardens of Babylon centuries later. Now look at the people swarming over the scaffolding. You might assume, based on Hollywood movies, that these are slaves being whipped by cruel overseers. Actually, they are citizens. This is the corvée system. In a world without money, you paid your taxes with your body. For a few months every year, when the harvest was done and the fields were fallow, free men, farmers, potters, weavers, were drafted to work on the king's projects. It was part of the social contract. You built the wall to protect your family. You built the ziggurat to keep the god happy so the river wouldn't flood. And in return, the state fed you. We have the ration lists. They were paid in grain, wool, oil, and, of course, huge quantities of beer. Building the ziggurat was essentially a massive, state-sponsored public works project that doubled as a beer festival. It created a sense of unity. You were sweating alongside your neighbors to build something that would last forever. But there is a loneliness to the ziggurat, too. As a regular person, you are allowed in the great courtyard at the bottom. You can smell the incense, hear the chanting, and watch the processions. But you can never climb those stairs. Only the high priest can ascend to the summit. He climbs alone, disappearing into the blue clouds of incense at the peak. He enters the waiting room to change the god's clothes, to offer the meal, to sleep in the sacred chamber hoping for a dream message. Up there the wind is loud. The city below looks like a toy set. The noise of the marketplace fades away. It is just the man and the sky. This structure represents the ultimate ambition of the Sumerian mind, to impose order on chaos, to build a geometric ladder that bridges the gap between the mud of the earth and the silence of the stars. But the Sumerians knew that no matter how high you built, there was always a force pulling you back down. They knew that for every ascent, there must be a descent. And so, to balance the ziggurat reaching for heaven, they wrote a story about a goddess who voluntarily climbed down into the deepest, darkest pit of the universe. A story that serves as a terrifying metaphor for the entropy that eventually claims all civilizations. We often think of myths as simple fairy tales, stories about lightning bolts and magic hammers. But occasionally, you stumble across an ancient story that feels less like a fantasy and more like a sophisticated session of psychoanalysis. The story of Inanna's descent into the underworld is one of those stories. It is the dark mirror of the ziggurat. While the priests were climbing up to reach the sky, their goddess was climbing down to touch the bottom. Inanna is the queen of heaven. She has everything: power, beauty, the city of Uruk, and the stolen me of civilization. She is the goddess of Venus, shining brightly in the evening sky. But she is not satisfied. She wants to know what lies in the great below. She wants to witness the domain of her older, darker sister, Ecological, the queen of the dead. So she prepares for the journey. She doesn't dress for a funeral. She dresses for a coronation. She puts on her turban of office, her lapis lazuli beads, her gold rings, her breastplate called "Come, Man, Come," and she carries her measuring rod of lapis. She wraps herself in the physical symbols of her ego and her power. She arrives at the gates of the underworld, the land of no return, and bangs on the door. "Open the house, gatekeeper! Open the house, Neti! If you do not open it, I will smash the door, I will shatter the bolt, I will raise up the dead, and they will eat the living." It is a threat of total zombie apocalypse. Neti, the gatekeeper, is terrified. He runs to tell Ereshkigal. Ereshkigal is not impressed. She is the queen of entropy. She knows that all things, no matter how bright, eventually come to her. She tells Neti, "Let her in, but follow the ancient laws." And here is where the story becomes a terrifying striptease of the soul. There are 7 gates to the underworld. At the first gate, Neti stops Inana. "Take off your crown," he says. Inana asks, "Why?" Neti replies with the most chilling line in Sumerian literature. "Quiet, Inana. The ways of the underworld are perfect. They may not be questioned." She removes her crown. She walks to the second gate. "Take off your earrings." She obeys. At the third gate, her necklace. At the fourth, her breastplate. At the fifth, her gold ring. At the sixth, her measuring rod. By the time she reaches the 7th gate, Inanna, the Queen of Heaven, the most powerful entity in the cosmos, is naked. She has been stripped of every symbol of her status, her wealth, and her identity. She is just a bare, shivering piece of biological matter. She enters the throne room bowed low. Ereshkigal is sitting on her throne. She doesn't welcome her sister. She looks at her with the eye of death. Inanna is struck dead instantly. Her corpse is turned into a side of green, rotting meat and hung on a hook on the wall. Pause for a moment. This is the goddess of love and war. This is the patron of Uruk, and she is hanging on a hook like a carcass in a butcher shop. It is a moment of total negation. It represents the ultimate reality, that death strips away everything you think you are. Your job title, your bank account, your reputation. It all gets taken at the gates. Back on Earth, nature stops. The animals stop reproducing. The people stop having sex. The world is dying because the life force is dead. Inanna's loyal servant, Ninshubur, goes to the great gods for help. Enlil says, "Not my problem. She wanted to go down there. She pays the price." Nana says the same. But Enki, the god of wisdom, and the one who always seems to hack the system, realizes that the cosmos is broken. He has to save her. But he can't invade the underworld with an army. You can't conquer death with force. So he goes to the dirt. He scrapes the filth from under his fingernails, literally the humblest material imaginable, and creates 2 strange, sexless creatures called the Kurgara and the Galatur. He gives them a very specific weapon. He doesn't give them swords. He gives them empathy. He tells them, "Go to Ereshkigal. She is in pain. She is mourning. When she cries, 'Oh my ins,' you cry, 'Oh our inside.' When she cries, 'Oh my outside,' you cry, 'Oh our outside.'" They fly down like flies through the cracks in the gate. They find the Queen of the Dead writhing in agony, suffering from the birth pangs of the dead. They don't attack her. They sit with her. They reflect her pain. Ereshkigal is shocked. No one has ever sympathized with death before. Everyone fears her. No one pities her. Touched by this act of compassion, she offers them a gift. "I will give you the river of water? The field of grain?" "No," they say. "Give us the piece of meat hanging on the hook." They take the rotting corpse of Inanna. They sprinkle it with the food of life and the water of life given to them by Enki. And Inanna gasps. She stands up. She is reborn. But the underworld has a law, the law of conservation of souls. No one ascends from the underworld without a substitute. If Inana leaves, someone else must take her place. She ascends, surrounded by demons looking for her replacement. She comes across her husband, Dumuzi the shepherd. While everyone else was mourning her death, Dumuzi was dressing up in rich robes and sitting on her throne, enjoying his newfound power. Inanna looks at him with the eye of death. She points to him and says to the demons, "Take him." This story is a masterpiece on so many levels. Astronomically, it tracks the cycle of the planet Venus. Venus is the morning star and the evening star. It disappears from the sky for a period, descending behind the sun, and then reappears, resurrected. Agriculturally, it explains the seasons. Dumuzi, the god of vegetation, dies and goes to the underworld for half the year, summer dry season, and his sister Geshtinanna takes his place for the other half. This cycle of death and rebirth ensures the crops grow. But psychologically, it is about the ego death. To become truly wise, to become fully integrated, Inanna had to lose everything. She had to be stripped naked, die, and accept her own powerlessness. Only then could she ascend. It suggests that the Sumerians understood that growing up requires a descent into the dark parts of your own psyche. You have to face your own Ereshkigal, your own shadow, your own depression, your own mortality, before you can really live. But while Inanna was cycling through death and rebirth, the Sumerian civilization itself was facing a much slower, more permanent kind of descent. They were being diluted. New people were arriving from the west, people who didn't speak Sumerian, who didn't know the old ways, and who were about to change the DNA of Mesopotamia forever. Stand on the walls of Uruk around 2000 BCE. Look to the west, toward the endless, scorching horizon of the Syrian desert. For centuries, this was just empty space, a void where the civilized world ended and the chaos began. But now, you see dust clouds, you see tents, you see people. They are coming. The Sumerians called them the Martu. In the Bible, they are the Amorites. To the city dwellers of the alluvial plain, these people were the ultimate nightmare. They were nomads. They didn't live in houses. They followed their herds. They didn't bury their dead in the floor. They buried them in the earth. There is a text from this period that drips with xenophobia. It describes the Martu as a ravaging people with the instincts of a beast, who knows not grain, who does not bend the knee, who eats raw meat. It's the classic civilization versus barbarian trope. The Sumerians built a massive wall, the Wall of the Martu, specifically to keep these immigrants out. It stretched for over 100 miles between the Tigris and Euphrates. It was the Great Wall of China of the Bronze Age, designed to protect the purity of the southern culture from the wild men of the West. But walls are static, and people are fluid. The wall failed. The Amorites didn't sweep over the walls in a single wave of fire and sword like the Mongols. They trickled in. They came first as raiders, then as day laborers, then as mercenaries hired by Sumerian kings to fight other Sumerian kings, and finally, they came as neighbors. This wasn't a conquest. It was a demographic shift. It was a slow-motion dilution. Walk through the marketplace now. The faces look the same, the unibrows, the woolen skirts. But listen to the noise. The sharp, clipped sounds of the Sumerian language are being drowned out by a new, rhythmic, guttural tongue. This is Akkadian, and its Amorite dialects. It is a Semitic language, the grandmother of Hebrew and Arabic. It is vibrant, flexible, and aggressive. For a few centuries, Mesopotamia becomes a bilingual world. It's like England after the Norman conquest, where the elite spoke French and the peasants spoke English, eventually merging into something new. In Sumer, the scribes and the priests still used Sumerian. It was the language of high culture, of the law, of the gods. But in the kitchen, in the barracks, and in the bed, people spoke Akkadian. Historians call this the symbiosis. The Amorites didn't want to destroy Sumerian culture. They wanted to be Sumerian. They looked at the ziggurats, the writing, the math, and the beer, and they said, "We want that." So an Amorite chieftain would conquer a city like Larsa or Babylon. He wouldn't burn it down. He would move into the palace. He would adopt a Sumerian name. He would hire a scribe to write a genealogy, proving he was actually descended from Gilgamesh. He would patronize the temples of Enlil and Enki. But beneath the surface, the software was changing. The old Sumerian gods were distant, bureaucratic, and bound by cosmic rules. The new Amorite gods were different. They were tribal chieftains writ large. They were personal. They were warrior kings. This shift is best seen in the rise of a city that, up until now, had been a minor, muddy village on a bend in the river. A place called Babelim, Babylon. Under the Amorite dynasty, specifically under a king named Hammurabi, Babylon explodes into prominence, and with it rises a new god, Marduk. Marduk is the ultimate Amorite rebranding of Sumerian theology. He isn't an old, tired administrator like Enlil. He is a young, vigorous hero. In the Babylonian creation myth, the Enuma Elish, the old gods are threatened by the chaos monster Tiamat. They are too scared to fight. Marduk steps up. He says, "I will save you, but on one condition. You must make me the boss." The old gods agree. Marduk kills the monster, splits her body in two to create the heaven and earth, and organizes the cosmos. He takes the power. This myth is a political allegory. The old Sumerian cities, Eridu, Ur, Nippur, were the old gods. Tired, ancient, and powerless. Babylon was Marduk, the new, vigorous superpower that would bring order to the world. But there is a sadness to this transition. As the Amorite influence grew, the Sumerian language slowly died as a spoken tongue. It became a dead language, preserved only in the Aduba schools by scribes who had to study it as a foreign classic, much like European priests studied Latin in the Middle Ages. We have tablets from this period where student scribes complain about how hard Sumerian is. "The grammar is impossible," they whine. They make jokes about mispronouncing words. It wasn't their mother tongue anymore. It was an academic hurdle. The blackheaded people were disappearing. Not by extinction, but by integration. Their genes were mixing with the Amorites, the Hurrians, and the Elamites. The distinct, isolated genius of the Sumerian spark was fading into the broader, louder, more violent tapestry of the Middle East. And as the people changed, the land itself began to turn against them. The final blow to the Sumerian heartland wouldn't come from a sword. It would come from the very water that had given them life. But before the silence fell completely, the poets of Sumer wrote a series of texts that are unlike anything else in the ancient world. They didn't write histories of victory. They wrote detailed, agonizing descriptions of their own destruction. They invented a genre called the lamentation. And in these texts, they give us a front-row seat to the apocalypse. History is usually written by the victors. We know this. The Romans wrote about how they civilized the Gauls. The British wrote about how they brought trains to India. But the Sumerians did something that almost no other civilization has ever done. They wrote beautiful, heartbreaking poetry about their own total defeat. They invented a genre called the city lament. Imagine if, after the fall of Rome, the Romans had written a 1,000-line opera detailing exactly how the Goths burned the Senate, not to blame them, but to express the sheer grief of the loss. That is what we find in the clay. The most famous of these is the Lament for Ur. It describes the events around 2004 BCE, when the glorious third dynasty of Ur finally collapsed. The Amorites were pressing from the west, and the Elamites, the eternal rivals from the Iranian mountains to the east, swept down to deliver the killing blow. The text doesn't just say, Ur was conquered. It takes you inside the siege. It forces you to look at the horror. The people, like pottery shards, filled the streets. The poet writes, "In the lofty gates, where they were wont to promenade, dead bodies were lying about. In the boulevards, where the feasts were celebrated, uttered they lay. In all the streets, where they were wont to promenade, dead bodies were lying about." The imagery of pottery shards is devastating. In a world made of clay, humans are just vessels. When the city breaks, the people shatter. They become debris. The lament describes the physical sensation of the city dying. The hunger is so intense that the social order dissolves. The mother would not care for her children. The father would not say, "Oh, my wife!" The young man lay on his side. The wet nurse did not sing a lullaby. It describes the smoke of the burning city hanging in the air like a shroud. It describes the great walls built by Ur-Nammu to last forever, being breached like a pot. But the most profound part of the lament isn't the violence, it's the theology. Why did this happen? Why did the gods allow their holiest city, the home of the moon god Inana, to be destroyed by people who do not know Bali? In the Bible, when Jerusalem falls, the prophets say it is because the people sinned. They worshipped idols. They broke the covenant. The destruction is a punishment. In the Sumerian lament, it is not a punishment. It is a verdict. The poet describes the great god Enlil calling a meeting of the divine council. Nana, the patron god of Ur, begs for his city. He weeps. He grabs onto Enlil's knees. "Do not let my city be destroyed," he pleads. Enlil looks at him and gives an answer that chills the blood. "Ur was granted kingship," Enlil says. "It was not granted an eternal term." It is a brutal statement of political philosophy. Nothing lasts forever. Every city has a term, like a lease. When that lease is up, the landlord takes it back. The universe is cyclical. The sun rises and sets. The moon waxes and wanes. Cities rise and fall. To expect Ur to last forever is to fight the laws of nature. So, the inevitable happens. The god leaves. This is the spiritual mechanism of defeat. A city cannot be taken as long as its god is resident. The god is the battery that powers the walls. So before the Elamites can burn the temple, Nana must abandon it. Nana, who loved his city, departed from the city. He flew away like a bird to its nest. Once the Melam, that terrifying divine radiance, is gone, the city is just a pile of mud bricks. The magic shield is down. The enemy pours in. The lament ends not with revenge, but with submission. The survivors sit in the dust and sing to Nana, accepting their fate. They acknowledge that the storm of Enlil cannot be opposed. This fatalism is the core of the Sumerian character. They were a people who lived on a flat plain, exposed to floods, storms, and invasions. They knew, deep in their bones, that security was an illusion. They built their walls high. They wrote their laws on hard clay. But they knew that in the end, the wind would blow it all away. And they were right. The Elamites burned Ur. The Amorites took over the administration. The language died out. But the final death of Sumer didn't come from soldiers. It didn't come from a change in management. It came from the ground itself. The Sumerians had committed a slow, invisible suicide over the course of 1,000 years. They had engineered their own extinction through the very technology that made them great. They had fought nature, and nature fought back with a weapon they couldn't see until it was too late. Salt. You know the saying, "salt the earth"? It usually refers to a conquering general destroying an enemy's land so nothing will ever grow there again. But in Sumer, they didn't need a general to do it. They did it to themselves, day by day, season by season, with the very water they worshipped. This is the environmental tragedy of the first civilization. It wasn't a war that killed the Sumerian heartland. It was an ecological suicide. To understand how this happened, you have to look at the dirt. The soil of southern Mesopotamia is sedimentary. It was laid down by the rivers over thousands of years. It is rich, but it has a flaw. It doesn't drain well. It's flat, heavy, and sits on top of a high water table that is naturally salty. For 2,000 years, the Sumerians were the masters of irrigation. They dug massive canals to bring water from the Euphrates into their fields. They turned the desert green, but there was a catch they couldn't see. When you flood a field in a place where the temperature hits 120 degrees, the water evaporates rapidly. But the water isn't pure H2O. It contains tiny trace amounts of dissolved salts. When the water evaporates, the salt stays behind. Year 1? You don't notice it. Year 10? Maybe the yield is a tiny bit lower. Year 500? You have a catastrophe. Also, by constantly flooding the land, they raised the water table. The salty groundwater from deep below was pushed up toward the surface. The roots of the plants were literally soaking in brine. We can actually track this slow-motion disaster in the accounting tablets. This is one of the coolest pieces of detective work in economic history. Around 3,500 BCE, the records show that the fields of Sumer produced about 50% wheat and 50% barley. Wheat is the premium crop. It makes better bread, it tastes better. But it is a diva. It cannot handle salt. By 2400 BCE, the records show the ratio had shifted. Wheat accounted for only 15% of the crop. Barley, the tough, salt-tolerant soldier of the grain world, was taking over. By 1700 BCE, wheat had completely disappeared from the southern records. It was 100% barley, and the yields were crashing. At the height of the early dynasties, a farmer could expect a return of 30 grains for every one seed planted. By the time of the final collapse, that number had dropped to 2 or 3 grains. Imagine the visual horror of this. You are a farmer in the city of Lhasa. You walk out to your field in the morning. It hasn't snowed. It never snows here. But the ground is white. A glittering crystalline crust of salt covers the furrows. It crunches under your sandals. You try to wash it away by pouring more water on it, but that only brings up more salt. It's a feedback loop of death. The blackheaded people watched their civilization starve. The me of agriculture had failed. The gods had broken their contract. This ecological collapse explains the geopolitical shift of the entire region. For 2,000 years, the south, Sumer, was the powerhouse. But as the soil turned toxic, the power moved north. The center of gravity shifted to Babylon, and then later to Assyria, Nineveh. Why? Because the land in the north had better drainage. The water table was lower. They could still grow wheat. The great cities of the south, Eridu, Uruk, didn't vanish overnight. They slowly turned into backwaters. The population dwindled. The great canals silted up because there weren't enough people to dredge them. The ziggurats, once covered in blue tile and green gardens, began to crumble into brown mounds. Eventually, the desert reclaimed them. The wind blew the sand over the walls Gilgamesh built. The house of the tablet fell silent. By the time the Greeks arrived under Alexander the Great in 331 BCE, most of these cities were unidentifiable ruins. They were just tells, mounds of dirt in a wasteland. It is a chilling reminder that technology cannot outrun biology forever. The Sumerians engineered a miracle, but they couldn't engineer a way out of the consequences. They turned their garden into a salt pan. But even as the cities died, the idea of Sumer refused to go quietly. The physical bodies of the Sumerians were gone, absorbed into the gene pool of the north. The language was dead on the street, but the ghosts of their thoughts were still trapped in the clay. And hundreds of miles to the north, in the terrifying military capital of Nineveh, a king with the soul of a librarian decided that he wasn't going to let those ghosts fade away. He was going to build the ultimate backup drive. Fast forward 1,000 years. We are leaving the salt-crusted ruins of the south and traveling north, to the banks of the Tigris, to the capital of the most terrifying empire the world has ever seen, Assyria. If Sumer was the land of the scholar-priest, Assyria is the land of the soldier-king. The Assyrians were the Nazis of the ancient world, ruthlessly efficient, militarily dominant, and proud of their cruelty. Their palace walls are covered in reliefs showing them flaying enemies alive and impaling prisoners on stakes. They built a war machine that crushed everything from Egypt to Iran. But sitting on the throne of this Death Star is a man who is different. His name is Ashurbanipal, and while he is definitely a brutal warlord, he once famously dined in a garden with the severed head of an Elamite king hanging from a tree next to him, he has a secret hobby. He is a nerd. Most Assyrian kings bragged about how many lions they killed, or how many cities they burned. Ashurbanipal brags about his literacy. In one of his inscriptions he says, "I, Ashurbanipal, within the palace, understood the wisdom of Nabu, the god of writing, all the art of writing of every kind. I made myself the master of them all." He claims he can read the obscure Sumerian and the dark Akkadian from the days before the flood. This guy didn't just want to conquer the world, he wanted to download it. He realized down that the ancient culture of Sumer, the culture we've been talking about all night, was fading. The old tablets in the crumbling southern temples were turning to dust. The language was being forgotten. So he launched the biggest salvage operation in history. He didn't send armies to loot gold, he sent scribes to loot data. He sent agents to the old cities, to to Nippur, to Uruk, with a specific command. Collect whatever tablets are in their houses and tablets that are in the Azida temple. He wanted rituals, medical texts, omens, and myths. When the scribes found a tablet that was too fragile to move, they copied it. And because they were dealing with a dead language, they did something that would eventually save modern archaeology. They created interlinear translations. Imagine a tablet where line 1 is the original ancient Sumerian and line 2 is the translation in contemporary Akkadian. They created dictionaries. They created grammar guides. They effectively built the Rosetta Stone for a language that had no living speakers. Ashurbanipal carted all of this back to his palace in Nineveh. He organized it into the first true library in the world. We aren't just talking about a pile of books. We are talking about a catalogued archive with tags on the shelves so you could find what you were looking for. He had the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Enuma Elish, the Descent of Inanna, all the greatest hits. He likely walked through these halls, running his fingers over the clay, believing he had preserved the knowledge of the gods forever. But history has a wicked sense of humor. In 612 BCE, the enemies of Assyria, the Babylonians, the Medes, and the Scythians, finally had enough. They formed a coalition and marched on Nineveh. They breached the walls, they slaughtered the inhabitants, and they set the palace on fire. Now, if Ashurbanipal had stored his wisdom on papyrus scrolls, like the Library of Alexandria, or on parchment, or even on digital servers, this would have been the end. The fire would have turned the history of Sumer into ash. But remember, Sumerian books are made of mud. When the Library of Nineveh caught fire, the temperature soared to over 1,000 degrees Celsius. The wooden shelves burned. The roof collapsed. But the clay tablets? They didn't burn. They baked. The fire turned the sun-dried clay into ceramic. It hardened them. It made them waterproof, rot-proof, and time-proof. The catastrophe that was meant to wipe the memory of the Assyrian kings from the face of the earth actually fossilized it. The ruins of the palace collapsed on top of the baked tablets, sealing them in a protective layer of dirt. They lay there, sleeping in the dark, for 2,500 years. Above them, empires rose and fell. The Persians came. Alexander the Great marched his phalanxes right past the mound of Nineveh, having no idea that the Epic of Gilgamesh was sleeping 10 feet beneath his boots. The Romans came. The Arabs came. The Mongols came. The Ottoman Empire rose. The world completely forgot about Sumer. The names Gilgamesh and Inanna and Enki vanished from human memory. The Bible became the only record of the deep past. We knew about Babylon and Nineveh because the prophets cursed them, but the civilization that started it all, the blackheaded people, was erased until the mid-19th century. That is when a new breed of adventurer arrived in Mesopotamia. These weren't conquerors. They were Victorians with shovels, pith helmets, and a desperate desire to prove that the Bible was true. They started digging into the strange mounds, tells that dotted the landscape. They were looking for sculptures. They were looking for gold. But what they found was a library of trash that would rewrite the origin story of the human race. For over 2,000 years, the land between the rivers was silent. The wind blew over the mounds of dirt in Iraq. The local Bedouin tribes called these mounds tells. They knew there were old bricks inside, sometimes strange little statues, but they had no idea that they were camping on top of the origins of human history. To the Western world, history began with Greece and Rome. Anything before that was a dark fog, illuminated only by the stories in the Bible. We knew about the Tower of Babel and the Chaldeans, but we thought of them as mythical villains, not real people with tax returns and school homework. Then came the Victorians. In the 1840s, a young British adventurer named Austin Henry Layard started digging into a massive mound near Mosul called Kuyunjik. He was looking for spectacular statues to ship back to the British Museum to impress the crowds. And he found them. He found the massive, winged bulls, lamassu, of the Assyrian palaces. But he also found something else. As his workmen cleared the floors of the burned palace of Sennacherib and the library of Ashurbanipal, they found the floor was covered in a layer of debris about a foot thick. It looked like broken pottery. Thousands upon thousands of little clay rectangles covered in tiny bird-like scratches. Layard didn't really know what they were. He packed them into crates, sometimes using them as packing peanuts to protect the stone statues, and shipped them to London. For years, these crates sat in the basement of the museum. The scholars looked at the bird tracks and scratched their heads. They called it cuneiform, wedge-shaped, but they had no idea how to read it. Was it a decorative border? Was it a magical code? The breakthrough came thanks to a daredevil officer named Henry Rawlinson. He found a massive inscription carved high up on a cliff face in Iran, the Behistun inscription. It was the same text written in 3 languages: Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. It was the Rosetta Stone of the East. By hanging off the cliff on a rope ladder, Rawlinson copied the text and cracked the code. Suddenly, the clay tablets in the British Museum basement weren't just trash. They were voices. But the real bombshell dropped in 1872. George Smith was a working-class engraver who had taught himself cuneiform during his lunch breaks at the museum. He was sifting through the broken fragments from Ashurbanipal's library when he picked up a piece of yellow clay. He started to read. He read about a ship resting on a mountain. He read about a man sending out a dove that returned because it found no resting place. Smith realized what he was holding. It was the story of Noah's Ark. But the tablet was from the 7th century BCE, and it was a copy of a story that was clearly thousands of years older than that. This wasn't a Bible. It was a pagan text that predated the Bible. The story goes that Smith was so overcome with excitement that he jumped up from the table, ran around the room, and began to undress. Why undressing was his reaction to scientific discovery remains a mystery, but it's a testament to the sheer adrenaline of the moment. When he announced his finding to the Society of Biblical Archaeology, it was a sensation. The Prime Minister was there. The newspapers went wild. It shattered the idea that the Hebrew Bible was the oldest and only record of antiquity. It proved that the flood myth was a shared cultural memory of the Middle East, not a unique revelation. But as the decades passed, the excitement shifted from the shocking to the mundane, which honestly is even more fascinating. In the 20th century, a scholar named Samuel Noah Kramer began translating the less dramatic tablets. He wasn't looking for floods or kings. He was reading the mail. He published a book called History Begins at Sumer, and in it, he listed the firsts that this civilization gave us. It wasn't just the wheel or the arch. He found the first school, the first case of juvenile delinquency, the first war of nerves, the first bicameral congress, the first historian, the first tax reduction case, the first love song. The love song is particularly touching. It was written by a bride to the king, Shusin, and it is surprisingly erotic. Bridegroom, dear to my heart, goodly is your beauty, honey-sweet lion, dear to my heart. Suddenly, the statues came to life. We realized that these people weren't alien mystics. They were us. They worried about their children disrespecting them. They complained about corruption. They fell in love. They were terrified of dying. The rediscovery of Sumer was like finding a baby photo of yourself that you didn't know existed. You look at it and see the resemblance. You realize that the things you think are modern problems, bureaucracy, stress, environmental collapse, the fear of the unknown, are actually the factory settings of civilization. We are still walking in their footprints. We are still dividing our hours by 60. We are still living in cities. We are still writing on tablets, albeit glass ones. This realization brings a strange kind of comfort. We are part of a long, continuous story. The people who pressed their reeds into the mud 5,000 years ago were sending a message in a bottle. They were saying, "We were here. We felt this. Don't forget us." And now, thanks to Ashurbanipal's baking oven and George Smith's lunch breaks, the bottle has washed up on our shore. We have read the message. We know who they were. And in doing so, we know a little bit more about who we are. But now, it is time to close the book. It is time to put the tablet back on the shelf. The journey is ending. Look at the device you are holding in your hand right now. Whether it's a phone or a tablet, feel the weight of it. Run your thumb across the smooth, cool surface of the glass. It fits perfectly in your palm, doesn't it? It is a rectangle, roughly the size of a human hand. You use it to scroll through information, to send messages to people far away, to record your thoughts, and to calculate your finances. Now, freeze that image in your mind, and replace the glass with wet clay. Replace the digital stylus with a reed cut from the marsh. The form factor hasn't changed in 5,000 years. The iPad is just the latest iteration of the tablet of Uruk. We have come full circle. Think about the material. We spent a few thousand years writing on papyrus, parchment, and paper, organic stuff that rots and burns. But now, we have returned to the earth. Your screen is made of glass, which is melted sand. The chip inside is made of silicon, which is purified from the earth's crust. We are once again writing on rocks. We are once again the people of the clay, trying to press our thoughts into the mineral bones of the planet before we die. But there is one terrifying difference between us and the scribe sitting in the shadow of the ziggurat. His tablet was heavy, clunky, and hard to edit. Once you baked it, it was done. But it was permanent. You could drop it in a swamp, burn it in a fire, or bury it under a collapsed wall for 3 millennia. And when you dug it up, the message would still be there. I am Gilgamesh. I delivered the sheep. I loved her. Our tablets? They are miracles of speed and light. We can access the entire sum of human knowledge in a microsecond. We can store the equivalent of Ashurbanipal's entire library on a chip the size of a fingernail. But our memory is fragile. If the power goes out, the screen goes black. If the server farm overheats, the cloud evaporates. If the magnetic charge on the hard drive fades, the data dissolves into static. We are building the most detailed, high-resolution civilization in history, but we are writing it in lightning, not in stone. Future archaeologists might dig up our cities in 5,000 years and find nothing. Just black rectangles of glass and plastic that tell them nothing about who we were, what we feared, or what we loved. We might be the silent century, the digital dark age. There is a profound irony in that. The Sumerians, who thought they were made of mud, achieved immortality. We, who think we are gods of the digital ether, might be forgotten. But maybe that's the final lesson of the ziggurat. The Sumerians knew that eternal is a word used by fools. They knew that the lease on the city always runs out. They knew that the flood eventually sweeps over everything, whether it's a flood of water, a flood of salt, or a flood of time. So they didn't write for eternity. They wrote for now. They wrote to bring order to the chaos of the present moment. They wrote to count the barley, to heal the sick, and to quiet the voices in their heads. And in doing so, they accidentally spoke to the future. We are doing the same. We are sending our own signals into the dark. We are building our own towers of data, hoping that someone, someday, will decipher our code and say, "Look, they were here. They were human. They were terrified. And they were brave." The cycle continues. The Anunnaki may have left the building, the me may have been uploaded to the cloud, and the ziggurats may be eroded stumps. But the impulse remains. The desire to leave a mark on the clay, to say, "I am." We are the new Sumerians. We are the blackheaded people, looking at the same stars, wrestling with the same demons, and holding the same tablet in our hands. And just like them, eventually, we have to put the tablet down. We have to let the river flow. We have to close our eyes. Now, the journey is over. The heat of the Mesopotamian sun is fading, replaced by the cool blue silence of the desert night. Imagine you are standing on the top of the great mound at Uruk. The city below you is gone. The noise of the market, the shouting of the merchants, the chanting of the priests, it has all drifted away on the wind. All that remains is the soft, endless whisper of the sand moving over the ruins. The great walls of Gilgamesh are just shadows now, gentle ripples in the earth. The canals are sleeping under the dust. The clay tablets are safe, buried deep in the cool, dark ground, waiting for the future to find them. Above you, the sky is vast and clear. The same stars that the priests watched from the ziggurat are wheeling overhead. The wild sheep, Jupiter, Mars, Venus, are continuing their slow, silent march across the ecliptic, indifferent to the rise and fall of empires. The river Euphrates is still flowing in the distance, a ribbon of dark silver reflecting the moon. It moves slowly, steadily, carrying the memory of the water to the sea. You don't need to build anything tonight. You don't need to count the grain. You don't need to fear the flood. The work is done. The me are safe. The scribe has smoothed the final line of clay. He has put down his stylus. He has blown out the lamp. The great house is sleeping. The ghosts are quiet. The history is written. And now you can drift away, floating on the deep, fresh waters of the Abzu, sinking slowly into the comfort of the dark.